Possiamo cominciare?
Okay, good morning. We can get started. I'd like to ask all of the members of this morning's panel, please, to come up and sit up here. At least those of them who are with us already. I understand that getting to Parliament here in the morning is often a little bit difficult. So, I would like to welcome Ms. Karamadeli, who is here with us today. She's the chair of the Transport Committee here at the European Parliament and is part of the Green Group. It's a great honour to have her with us today, so thank you very much for coming. The other members of this morning's panel that are here already, well, we don't have Mr. Tarabella with us just yet. I understand he'll be joining us a little bit later. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Alan Alakula, who works at the European representative in Tallinn. I'd like to welcome Mr. Alain Flausch, who's coming. Okay, not here yet. I spoke to him on the phone, but don't know his face, so he'll be joining us in a moment. Michael van Holten is a member of the German Parliament. I was also sub-secretary. Okay, in the Netherlands, I apologise. Okay. Okay. Who else do we have with us? We have Mr. Wojciech Koblowski. I'm sure you'll introduce yourselves anyway when you start your presentations, so perhaps I don't need to run through all of this now. And Mr. Lukasz Lugowski is also here with us this morning. He's an opinion leader on free public transport. So I'll kick us off. Karamadeli has not got a huge amount of time to spend with us today, so perhaps she would like to start and give us a few introductory words before we move on to other speakers.
I would like to get English, but I cannot understand it.
Number 2.
Let me say something.
Can you hear the English booth? This is the English booth. Can you hear the English booth?
Okay, great. Hello everyone, dear Daniela, it's my colleague really. Thanks for inviting me on this event on such an interesting topic. Interesting as there is no unanimous position over free public transport, and that also why you are all attending on a one-day event dedicated it. The topic of free public transport raised many questions. Question about the financing of public transport. Question about the access of public transport. Should we talking about a right to public transport in the same ways as we consider free access to education a right? In this new perspective, the user will that not be considered as a client, customer, anyone, but simply as a citizen. I may be a bit provocative here, but is it a legitimate question? As the cost of transport is still today a barrier for some people to enter the job market. Finally, there is also the question of the modal shift. By making public transport free, are we attracting the right people? And by right people, I mean the car driver and not just the pedestrian and the cyclist. Is it by convincing a car driver to switch to public transport and soft mode? And this measure will have a clear impact on congestion, air pollution, on health problem caused by traffic. I was last week at the informal Council of Transport Ministers in Tallinn.
I know.
You know that. Tallinn is the first European capital to have implemented free transport for its inhabitants since 2013. Yeah, that's right. Tallinn has based its financial model in the new income linked to the increase of people and registering as inhabitants in the city. I see that among today's speakers there is one, you, from city of Tallinn. I will be quite interesting to hear his opinion, but I cannot stay, so I have my assistant. Yeah, she make me a briefing, because for me it's very important about your available of your model in the long term, and to hear me about the repercussion this measure has had on frequentation of public transport in your city. More and more cities have been now experimenting with free transport. For example, I have just an example. In my constituency, in the north of France, a city, the name is Dunkerque. As a set of free public transport at weekends, and we spread this measure to other days of the week as of September. Let me share with you some interesting findings about the Dunkerque experience. The use of public transport, which usually is below 5% in Dunkerque. Dunkerque is very much a car city and reach 78% during the weekend. The first people they are benefiting from this measure are families, the elderly, and the young people who otherwise we will not go to the seaside or the market without free public transport. In addition, in this debate, we don't forget the social aspect, because in my city, in Dunkerque, free transport during the weekend has had a positive impact on generation of the city center, which has suffered from people deserting the center in favor of the big shopping center in the suburbs. The measure has attract people in the center that will not have gone there if it wasn't for free. For me, free transport is very much like of the question of mobility for all, and as the accessibility of transport. At this moment, the French government has just launched an important stakeholder consultation over mobility in order to prepare the new legislative framework for mobility in France that will be discussed next year. I'm very actively taking part in the process. I will do my best to ensure that this concept with free transport, because we have sustainable mobility, but mobility for all. So it will be very interesting to see if free transport will be part of the major debate. That's the reason why I'm very happy to open this debate here. I hope tomorrow we can open this debate in my committee, in Committee Transport. But I'm sure I am aware that I may have raised more interrogations. I've given you answer, and I wish you fruitful days with interesting debate. And I will definitely very interested in knowing the outcome of your discussion, because yes, I'm a chairwoman of Transport Committee. I have a responsibility when you talk about citizen. We are not only Europe and citizen, but now we need a concrete action to have a reconciliation. And I believe the mobility with this new debate about public transport will be great to have this reconciliation. Thank you really for inviting me. And I'm sorry because I have another meeting, but please give me a briefing, okay? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Grazie. Merci. Merci. Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karima. Before I pass the floor to our other speakers, I'd just like to give you a brief introduction to the topic, if I might. Since I've been in Parliament, thanks to work done by people working in regions who have spoken to me, since I've been here, this has been a topic that I've been dealing with. And the reason that I have decided to focus on this issue is because, I mean, in Italy, this is a kind of utopia, an impossible dream. People say free transport, what a lovely idea, but where's the money for that going to come from? And I think that's one of the questions that we're absolutely going to have to answer during the debate today, because I'm certain that there are answers to the concerns that people have, and some very convincing answers at that. And people who work in the transport sector, of course, are aware of this. However, there is increasing motivation to obtain free transport. And the major problem that the EU has to face at the moment, or one of them at least, is unemployment and the poverty that comes with it. Nowadays, we're constantly bombarded with figures relating to unemployment, youth unemployment, and often these are statistics that speak of different political motivations, and often, therefore, it's difficult to get a general overview of what the actual situation is as regards poverty in Italy or in Europe generally. In Europe, there are more than 100 million citizens that are living in conditions we would describe as poverty. And so the situation really is clearly very serious. In Italy, we've got quite a serious numbers of people living in poverty. So what is it that we can do to meet this challenge and face up to the reality of poverty in our country? The fact is that poverty does still exist, and it's impossible to imagine that overnight we're just going to return to a pre-crisis situation. That's not going to happen. The pre-crisis world with its generous welfare systems is a thing of yesterday. We won't see it again. And so it's important that we deal with what we're facing today with what we've got today. And we should use the crisis to create a new balance, to create a new way of moving forward, and to find new solutions for citizens that find themselves living in very difficult situations. So what have we heard from the EU on this? Well, we've heard funding for major projects, instruments introduced for infrastructure as well, particularly in the area of transport. We've heard of specific projects. We're talking about infrastructure for the future, but we are talking about something which is quite long term, and what we need is more short term responses to these questions. And so whether these measures come from the EU at European level or whether they come from the member states, often they're not very effective in fighting poverty and unemployment. So what is it that we have to do? Well, we have to work from the bottom up. We have to try to really work with the very simplest of tools. By making public transport free, we would be able to provide important resources for families of a low and medium income. It will help them with their mobility. And so, yes, of course, this is something that absolutely has to be discussed. However, there seems to be a huge amount of pressure now at local level to have free transport. And it is recognised now just how much of an impact this could have on people. And not because this is just an abstract idea, but because this could have real demonstrable effects on families. There are figures that you can see today that say that making public transport free would have a considerable effect on families. This isn't just an idea, this isn't hypothetical. We're not talking about some kind of fantasy world. Instead, we've got real figures that talk about real situations. Having said that, what is the other response that public transport might be able to provide within the European Union today? Well, it can provide a solution for other problems as well, and this is something we've been talking about a lot in the EU amongst the various different topics that we're talking about, and that is the reduction of pollution. And this is obviously an incredibly important point. I've prepared a couple of slides for you on this topic. Of all emissions in the EU, the amount of those emissions that transport accounts for is around 25%. And of that 25%, other forms of transport don't really have a huge impact as compared to the enormous share of those emissions that are produced by private transport vehicles. This is because the majority of private transport is carried out in vehicles which contain just one person. So this is a major problem that we have to be able to respond to. And when we're looking at pollution, it also, of course, leads to a lot of congestion, a lot of traffic in our cities. In Italy, in all of our major cities, all over Europe, we're seeing an enormous amount of congestion. And the cities now are trying to reduce urban transport by introducing tolls or congestion charges. But these are not structural solutions. They're not long-term solutions. They simply aren't able to make a big enough contribution. Free public transport in Italy does exist in a few small areas. We've had a bit of experience with this. A small town in Foggia has been providing free public transport And this has been financed by the introduction of wind turbines in the area. And so instead of this being covered by some kind of congestion charge, instead it's been financed by the wind park. And so what I'm trying to say here is that there are other ways of being able to pay for or cover the loss of the amount of money that you get from the tickets that people pay for on the bus. Now, of course, yes, there's often additional costs involved. It's not just the buses. You have to provide the ticket, provide the ticketing machine, and the whole system. I mean, we're talking about some quite considerable costs. But this is something that we'll talk about later, of course. So, what have we done on this issue in the Transport Committee here at the Parliament? Well, for me, of particular importance was when Karima Delli joined the committee as chair. This is something which hasn't been dealt with a lot in the European Parliament, but which nonetheless is very important. And so we've had an opportunity to deal with this topic. I think it's important that we do, for the reasons that I've already outlined, but also because I think it's very important that the European Union commit itself to providing incentives to local administrations, which in Italy at least certainly are responsible for dealing with public transport. It's important that these local administrations are encouraged and are aware of this kind of thinking. So what's been done thus far? Well, there have been recommendations produced by the European Parliament. We have dealt with the issue of sustainable transport quite a lot. And while talking about sustainable transport, we have dealt with free public transport, and this is one of the major topics, in fact, that needs to be looked at and needs to be incentivized. So on a personal level, what have I done? Well, every year the Parliament gives the MEPs an opportunity to put forward ideas in the form of pilot projects. This goes to the committee competent for that issue, then to the budgetary committee, and then to the plenary. And with these kinds of pilot projects, we can fund ideas, projects, and experiences. And so, within the framework of such a pilot project, I requested a study to look at the feasibility of free public transport within the European Union. And this project, this study project, was financed with €150,000 from the European Union, with a whole team looking at the feasibility throughout the EU of the idea. What's been done thus far in Italy then? Well, a lot has been done by the Five Star Movement in Italy. We believe in this cause. Not only have we had meetings, studies in Italy, however, in Parliament in Rome, there's also been amendments to incentivize the application of this in areas, in small towns. However, in the Venice region, they have made have had certain experiences there, but it's quite difficult to get real dialogue on this topic. these topics that are open to various different political powers and are open for discussion really must be discussed. I think it's an area where we can get some quite considerable advantages. It's important that we talk about the issues and the potential confusion that there may be around the topic, but it is important that we talk about this. It's a way of helping vulnerable people. And now, of course, getting free public transport for absolutely everybody is a big step to take initially. And so it's easier perhaps to do it step by step, to look at perhaps providing it for the more vulnerable parts of the population or for just small sections of the population initially. Maybe we could look at specific towns where maybe there are suburbs that are particularly cut off or particularly far away from the town centre, ensuring that people can get into town without necessarily having to pay for the privilege. So I don't want to go on for too long. I know that there's a lot of people to talk today who've got a lot of information to share with us. So firstly, I will pass the floor then to Mr. Alan Alakula. If you'd like to go first. So the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you for arranging this, I would say, historic event, because to my knowledge it is the first time when in European Parliament there is a dedicated to the free public transport something is held. So really it's a big day for places where the free public transport is implemented and to the places where it's still in process and where it's intended to be implemented. Also, of course, the status of our meeting was excellent due to the presence of the chair of the Transport Committee. So it's a great day for the people interested from free public transport. Thank you for that. I will give you a short picture about Tallinn, how we have done it in Tallinn, and you can shift to the first slide if I can't. Can I change myself slides or so give you a short picture of Tallinn and our links to the other cities, from where we got the idea and to the places which are referring to us as a role model, as an example. As Ms. Deli already said, Dunkirk exactly is referring to Tallinn's model, and we have had exchanges with her home city as well already. So Tallinn population is steadily growing, now reached 446,000, and the growth in last 5 years has been 30,000 residents. Out of the city 700 million budget, public transport budget makes around 1/10. It's 66 now, 66 millions. All what is funded from city budget to the public transport. And the ticket revenue, in this regard, we can speak of the recent history. Ticket revenue has been 17 million in 2012. It's a year before we shifted to free public transport. And from the residents, it was collected 12 million euros annually. So the cost of free public transport for city of Tallinn is estimated as 12 million euros annually. So we can move the slide. Can we move the slide? The reasoning why we did it in Tallinn, and the reasoning differs in all places, almost all places which have knew so far. In big cities, like in Paris, where the free public transport is occasionally exercised in air emergency, it has been exceptionally done due to the urgent air situation. There is nothing to breathe. In Chinese cities, in Chengdu, they do it before morning peak only due to the traffic situation. Not even necessarily the air situation, but traffic. They just can't fit the cars in the city. In Tallinn, the first and most urgent reason for considering and for implementing free public transport has been social urgency. People were not able to afford public transport ticket, and people said that they can't use public transport due to the ticket cost anymore. It was revealed by annual public services satisfaction surveys, so it became evident. Actually, Tallinn is not unique in this regard. In 2014, there has been done Eurobarometer survey, Europe-wide survey, which indicated Europe-wide that in the cities, the free public transport ticket cost revealed as a main obstacle for improving mobility in the cities. If European people were asked what is the main barrier for mobility in the cities, all European countries, people said that it was ticket cost. And on the top positions in this regard were, I would say, the richest per capita incomes countries. It was Germany, Holland, Sweden. All the richest were in the top. So it's not only unique Estonian or East European. It's Europe-wide big. I would say the biggest issue in regard of usage of public transport is ticket cost, not quality. Quality always is important, the quality of the service, but ticket cost was revealed as a main issue. At least definitely something what can't be ignored. So with us, it was social urgency. Affordability was the main aspect. Second objective, it was we presumed we can thus stimulate the labor market, we can stimulate the consumption of local goods and services to provide additional mobility. People go out more on evenings, weekends for entertainment, for consumption, consuming local things. And only on third position in Tallinn, in the size of the city of Tallinn, it became green aspect, and then with us it was not so it is not so much air or noise, but with us it's a space in a city center. We have also too little space, particularly in and around Old Town, and then we can't fit the cars in our city center. So the green aspect, space aspect was only on the third position. Next slide, please. We have done it through the referendum, local referendum. No wonder 75% of people were in favor. It should be pretty universal if asked anywhere. But the meaning and the reason for having a referendum was not to know what people think. We can learn it everywhere with polls, with much cheaper methods. But it was the reason and the meaning of the referendum was to involve as much as possible people to the decision making, to lock the decision politically as strongly and as long as possible. So once people have participated, voted, no slight change in a city government, not even in a council, can change the popular will. So it was meant to lock the decision. And so far we have had it 5 years lasting, and I would say there is no public debate over a return to paid public transport. So people are happy, and this popular decision effectively silences, let's say, possible opposition from other parties. So we have local elections in 2 weeks in the mid of October coming, and free public transport is almost no issue, in a sense that there is nobody who is promising to return to paid public transport. And it's only and evident reason is people like it, and it would be politically suicidal to speak the opposite. Next slide. To start with free public transport, we facilitated and increased the speed of the buses by extending dedicated bus routes or separated bus routes through the city center, which was important and which was probably not possible without having had referendum for prioritizing public transport. So making bus lanes, it was sensitive preliminary step. And the other major step what has been undertaken, it was a raising, I would say, severe raising of parking tariffs in the city center. Once there was promise that we have a free public transport, it became politically viable to raise sharply parking tariffs. And then in Tallinn Old Town, it's €6 per hour, 7 days a week across the clock, and in wider city center area, 4.80 euros. I don't think we find in Brussels any comparable tariff on street parking. If I look on the occupancy rate, still it did not change remarkably. And according to occupancy rate, I would say there is still space for increase of parking tariff. But let's say parking tariffs are remarkable. And it's became possible in context of having free public transport. If you want to complain on the parking tariff, on the heavy tariff, we have a free public service alternative. Next slide. How it became possible fiscally in Tallinn, it's you can't copy it everywhere. Not in Italy, you can copy it, and many cities do copy it in Poland. We know there is intention to copy in the fiscal model in Bratislava, which is under discussion now, Bratislava region. It's personal income tax. Our municipal budget mostly is formed from the residents' personal income tax. So it's a residency matters, not your employment place. And so municipalities are in heavy competition for having a residence and providing free service for residents brought evidently more taxpayers and increases the city budget. As I once notioned, 30,000 plus residents we have got in last 5 years. And this, by the most conservative estimate has brought to Tallinn city at least 20 million euros. If the cost for the city lost ticket revenue was 12 million and city earned from additional tax revenue at least 20 million. So it's evident we were able not only cover the loss of ticket revenue, we were able substantially invest additionally to public transport service quality and to service quality of other public services as well. So city budget became bigger. Next slide. In results in mobility were, I have to admit, modest. Modest compared to the French cities, to Polish places, which we have learned where the change occurred much bigger. In Tallinn, we have achieved only 10% growth of the trips made by bus, tram, and trolleybus, 3 modes we have in public transport. It mostly explains by the fact that the retired people, 65 plus, have had free ride already before, and the youth had double discount before. So for youth, the affordability wasn't very urgent issue already before. But still, I would say 10% increase remains modest. Parallelly, I would say from the October of 2013, little later than in municipal network, we started free public transport also in commuter trains in the city, inside the city. And in trains where there was no discount for retired people and for students, the increase of usage occurred was 700%, 7 times. So it's a pretty standard what has occurred in French cases and in Hasselt in Belgium as well, which is not free public place anymore. But the train case with us is definitely the showcase where we have tested that the service quality itself and only service quality does not bring the change. The price may matter and the price may be most important factor. The trains were with us is a case where the new trains were brought to operation and new trains brought no change in usage. But half a year after, when we shifted to the free ride for the Tallinners, the change occurred. So it's exact case where the only quality does not bring any visible change, may not bring any visible change. Next slide. Tallinn did not invent the concept. I even wonder who invented it because Michael definitely would be able to tell afterwards many cases already and discussions from the late 60s, still alive cases from the early 70s in France, from 1972, I think is still consequently ongoing free public transport city, which I can't name, but there is a little town in France. 1975 as well. There were big cities in Italy. This audience definitely knows much better than me. In Bologna, Rome, short trials of free public transport, failed trials, I understood. But still, since 70s and afterwards, many cities have done it in Europe. Most of them in France. Hasselt has been also a long story from, I think, 1987, since 2014 or 15. In Poland, relatively recent cases, little before Tallinn started, or simultaneously with Tallinn started, Žori in Silesia, in West, in most of them are in West. Silesia, Lubin in Silesia, Ząbki, satellite of Warsaw. So I would say France and Poland are the main territorially well-covered free public transport countries in Europe. But the cases are also elsewhere. In Sweden, there is Avesta, Jokkmokk, some more places. And Tallinn was learning carefully available experience. First, we connected with Aubagne with satellite of Marseille, which then was biggest free public transport, still at the moment is biggest free public transport area in France. Dunkirk is overtaking next year, being double as big as Dunkirk area by population. And we also connected to Polish cities. And we held 2 free public transport events in Tallinn. We were happy to assist having free public transport conference in Žori, also in Avesta in Sweden. And we also linked to the Chengdu, Chinese, 16 million residents metropolitan area, which has not, of course, not in full free public transport, but which exercises in meaningful size free public transport in feeding lines network around the second ring road. And there is also full terrestrial public transport is free before the morning peak from 5 to 7 a.m. All surface public transport is free, so except metro, everything in Chengdu before morning peak is free. So, but it's already big metropolitan city regularly having free public transport. And as I noted, Dunkirk was officially connected to Tallinn on the basis of free public transport. I was very happy to know that Karima Delli is from Dunkirk herself, so it's a meaningful link, additional link to us as well. And the most recent international networking occurred Bratislava, which is facing regional president elections soon in November, early November, and one of the main campaign topics became implementing free public transport for residents in Bratislava region. They have a meaningful proportion of non-registered actual residents, and they are considering free public transport as possible tool to increase the capital region budget this way, similarly as it has been done in Tallinn city. Next slide. If Tallinn branded himself as a capital of free public transport, then I'm happy to say that we may not remain alone for long, or at least I hope we will not remain the only capital. Technically, there is a Tórshavn, capital of Faroe Islands, formally not belonging to EU but being part of Denmark, which has free for all public transport. Population is, I would say, a bit above 10,000, 12,000, I guess, but still capital. Bratislava, I already noted, the sitting president of the region, Pavel Fresho, is campaigning and dictated to the campaign agenda of others, also free public transport issue. And from last year, there came a news from the Bucharest mayor, who took office in mid-term, and with promise to implement free public transport, but so far, or after that, it remained silent, but at least there was another capital where the issue was raised. Next slide. Here is a map of France, well covered with free public transport places. Next slide. Poland as well. And the last, but not least, Estonia as a country, as a state, as a nation, is considering to become a free public transport state. Since last November, we have a new government, center-led government, the same party which governed and governs Tallinn. Government which committed to free public transport to be implemented on all county lines. So it's regional buses all over the country would become free, and it has been repeatedly recommitted. And the date named is July next year, as the regional buses will be free to everybody. Fiscally, it's from a national perspective, it's not big figures, so it's not issue of availability of funds. It's because 75 up to 80% of existing service in county lines are already subsidized, so it's almost free already. Like it's in many places, free public transport is almost free already, but it's not. Usually, it's not recognized. The subsidy level in Europe is usually well above the half, so we can't speak about the market anyway. But so Estonian government is very likely to implement free public transport for everybody. For Tallinn, it will have a direct impact in a way that when the county around city will be free to everybody, Tallinn can't continue for having free public transport for residents only. If county around us is free to everybody, then Tallinn inevitably have to open also free service to everybody. So it may not take place at the same moment, but very soon after shift in county, Tallinn I would say inevitably would become also free for all public transport city. Next slide. And yes, I welcome you visit our dedicated website, which has all conference materials, which I mentioned about free public transport, and I definitely am sure we will have also presentations there also from today's event. Thank you.
Grazie, Alan.
Thank you, Alan. Perfect. Now, I should like to give the floor to the assistant of our colleague Mark Tarabella, because Mr. Tarabella unfortunately had another commitment, so you're going to be speaking on his behalf.
The invitation, it's a great initiative. I'm spokesman for the Socialists and working for Mark Tarabella, but actually is blocked in a negotiation this morning. I'm just a bit surprised that we have this, this meeting right now. I think public transport should be a topic since 10 years at the European Parliament, but it was not the case. You gave me 20 minutes to talk about the public transport for free in Belgium. To be honest, I just need 1 minute to tell you that in our country it doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist anymore. And public transport almost for free is really an exception in Belgium. But it's true, Belgium is probably a nice country, is a nice country. But also so complex. First of all, it's important to be clear on the situation. To answer to this question is as complex as the federal situation in Belgium for those who know it. The competence of buses and trams is ruled by the regional level. The following consequences is that every region has its own regional society in charge of the public transportation. On the contrary, the train transports are ruled by the federal authorities, so it creates troubles all the time. Each society has its own prices, which can be different, but concerning preferential rates, they are targeting the same people, under 25 and after 65, and people with disabilities. If we should give an approximation, then in terms between 37 and 49 euros per month for a subscription for an average adult. Regarding the SNCB, SNCB is the society, the companies of train, the national company of train in Belgium. The prices are definitely much higher. For example, an outward and return journey from Liège to Brussels costs 30 euro and 15 euro to Anvers. To take an example, Liège-Brussels is 30 euro, okay? If I go by car, it costs me 15 euro. So of course, it doesn't give me courage to go in the train and to share my space with people that I don't know, maybe smell, maybe smoke, or maybe many things. And of course, I prefer to stay in my car. And of course, the first step that we should do on the national level is to promote train. And to promote train is totally to decrease the price. That's the first step which we should do, but we are not able to do it. I'm not in the government, that's why I'm really happy to push a bit this situation. So there is a difference between half of the price, and it's definitely too much to promote the train transportation. The priority is therefore to control the price evolution of the public transport to guarantee the social accessibility and a better respect of equity principle. We need to change the pricing policy to move towards an incomes-oriented pricing policy. Following us, it would be better to implement a degressive method of pricing based on the real incomes that people are receiving. You will tell me that I'm socialist, but we think that it would be a better solution than to have a free transportation. It could be at the end create different kinds of subscription from 5 till 100% of the normal price. And I'm really sorry that I came after your presentation, because of course Belgium now really looks amazing, but in the bad side. And it's quite true about the common transportation. The first step is also to recognize that we are doing wrong. and there is many example, really good example of common transport for free everywhere in Europe. In France, there is 7 cities in the last few weeks, months, and years, and where it's really working well. Now there is Dunkerque. Dunkerque is really close from the Belgian border. I hope that it will give hopes and courage to the national authorities to promote the transport for free or transport with facilities. I think that's everything that I have to say, except the last thing that when I listen to my colleague here, I really think that we are really far behind many other countries, but we are really at the beginning of this challenge. And that's a European challenge. Europe has really a role to promote public transport for free. And it's, of course, the rationale and the city's responsibility. But if Europe promotes this topic, of course, there will be many cities more motivated to do it. Thank you.
La ringrazio.
Thank you. Now, what I thought I'd say, having listened to the intervention of Mr. Tarabella's assistant, is that we are not all looking at things in the same way. We want to hear from everybody, and we're going to hear now something slightly different from the simple premise of promoting public transport free for all. I think we want to hear what's going on everywhere so that we can have a debate, a discussion, because after we've heard all the interventions this morning, we shall be opening the floor to questions to the speakers, so that we can exchange viewpoints, different viewpoints, depending on the questions. I think that what we're trying to do is to open people's minds. We don't want to necessarily look at things in exactly the same way. So I should now like to give the floor to Mr. Alain Flage, who is the Chief Secretary of the UITP.
Looking at the title of my presentation, you understand that I think this is going the wrong direction. And as you may understand, I'm not speaking on my behalf. I'm speaking on behalf of more than 1,500, that is basically 95% of the public transport company in the world. We are in 98 countries. We have 16 regional offices. And in fact, we are gathering operators, organizing authority, industry, universities, and consultants. And so what I'm going to express today is generally the common understanding by my sector of what public transport is all about. In addition to that, I used to be the CEO for 11 years of the local Brussels Transit Company. And I've been involved very much into this free public transport issue because, as somebody mentioned before, Hasselt was one of the major cases. And at that time, and that's what I want to make as a statement, it was introduced by a very populist socialist, Flemish socialist person, Mr. Steyaert, who was actually a bartender and who actually left our world recently because he had been in major embezzlement. What I want to mean is that once you start speaking free public transport, you're playing with concept, which is, first of all, it's a false truth. Somebody's paying. Of course, the taxpayer is paying instead of the user. And this is extremely, as you know, we say generally that there's no free lunch in America, but there's no free lunch in Europe either. A service needs to be paid, even if, and I do concur with the Socialist Party on that regard, when you want to help some of the most precarious population, you may have social fares. And social fares are a pretty good way to do it. If you have an income below this or this, then you would enjoy it. And we're doing that in Belgium, and it works pretty fine. let's go on and I'll try to make the argument. Next slide, please. Public transport demand has been growing for the last 15 years. Actually, in Brussels, public transport demand doubled in 10 years. Not because of free public transport. And I'm surprised to have heard here, because it's not evidence-based, that customers or non-customers of public transport are considering price as an issue. It's not true, I'm afraid. All the surveys, and I tell you, I can provide you with all the surveys all over the world. The major issue to encourage modal shift or to stay in public transport when you are already a user of public transport is quality. And when I mean quality, it's not only the train. New trains, of course, are better. But it's the comfort, it's the frequency, so the headways, it's the regularity, all things that are much more important. And when somebody who is driving a car says, I don't want to use public transport, it's because the speed of public transport may be too low. It's because they don't have accessibility in a distance which is acceptable. But it's never the price. Price ranks fifth. So I can't understand. This is a very political debate eventually. But from the facts, it's not true. The only place where the price is an issue is in the UK. And for those who have been in the UK, you certainly know how expensive it is to travel in the UK. Because there you pay the price and the cost by the same token. Whereas in the rest of Europe, generally subsidies are included. And I'll come back on this. And those subsidies go up to 48% as an average in Europe. It's not, maybe in Tallinn it was more than that. But as an average in Europe, it goes, and you'll see it in the next slide. The cost coverage, what we call the cost which is covered by fares, the fare box, is an average of 52%. It goes very high in England, it goes very high in Germany. It is lower in certain countries. In Brussels here it's 52%, so just average. In the north of Belgium, it's 30%, less than 25%. In the south, it's around 30%. So the burden of paying the fare box by the state may be very huge. Here in Brussels, it will be 200 million that you have to subsidize by the taxpayer. So although I can understand, and when you're talking about 10 million, you're not really in deep trouble if you can generate it. In most of the city, especially the big cities or the medium-sized city, it's unaffordable. And I'm sorry to say that this is my part of my work every day, unsustainable. Because on the long run, and let me tell you the story of what happened in Belgium in this regard, the state realized it's not payable. For some of you who have been here in Belgium for a while, you might remember that in early 2000, there was this decision to go free public transport for seniors. This is something which exists partly in London, for instance, but in Belgium it was a disease that started in Flanders, then came to Brussels, because Brussels is close to Flanders, and then the balloon couldn't really escape it. What happened is, first of all, as you know, in Belgium, 60% of the wealth is in the end of the 65 plus. So it's already a nonsense to give free public transport to people who are the most wealthier in the city. Second, in Brussels, it was about 165,000 people. That's the number of seniors in Brussels. Actually, when we made the survey later, we realized that only 80,000 were using public transport. And by and large, after 10 years, the government from each region decided that free was stupid because it wasn't used properly and that it was much better to ask a special social fare, as was mentioned by the gentleman from Belgium, which is something between, it's cheap in Flanders, which is strange, and it's more expensive in Brussels because the network is better, but it goes from 35 to 65 euro per year, which is already, and when this decision was taken, we immediately saw who was really using public transport, because then you make your calculation, you say, okay, do I use it frequently? Is it worth taking the yearly subscription, or is it better that I pay whenever I use it? So you see that it's always, on the long run, unsustainable. And Bologna had the same issue. They started for several years, and after some time, they couldn't afford it. And I'm afraid it will happen everywhere. Next. Just few background arguments. The fare level, in general, have not evolved to reflect the cost of production. As you know, whenever you have a fare increase, the day after, in the paper, you say everything is increasing, it's terrible. Even just having inflation introduced in the fare has been difficult. And the government, as you know, are generally mastering the fares and mastering the subsidy. So they have everything in their hands to decide, do we want to raise the taxes or do we want to raise the fares? Generally, making regular fare adjustment is the right way to do it, because costs are increasing. Salaries are indexed. Fuel may go up and down, and you have formula in many countries of the world where you introduce all those factors and you finally come to a fair increase. And the message that we're telling everybody, you should know this. Public transport is struggling for funds most of the time, of all the time. It's a terrible issue for us, for the CEO of any public transport company, to get the right money to do what? Because by the same token, politicians are telling us that they want to increase the modal shift. They want to reduce the congestion in the city. They want to reduce pollution. All arguments, they want to increase economic growth. And you know that in cities like London, without the public transport, the city would be down. So if you want to increase the modal shift, you need money. Where do you find the money? Do you want to take all from the taxpayer, and even for those who don't use? Or do you want, on the contrary, to find that money to increase the network, to make the modal shift possible? If you take the money from the fare and you say the state will take it over, that is immediate reduction of the capacity to invest. Because there is no free lunch in Europe. If you don't have the money and you have to subsidize the fare, of course that money is not available for investment. So it's the wrong way to do it. People should not pay the full cost. And so there is a consensus in Europe that about half of the operating cost should be paid by the user, because thereby it gives them worse to the service that you get. But by the same token, we need some subsidy, but not. In Germany, it's only 10 to 15%. Not that much. And the subsidy should be then used for investment. Because if you build the metro system, obviously it's not just for 5 years. It's not the political term of 5 years. It's something for 100 years or 150. And so you need this. So diversifying the source of revenue for public transport is absolutely a need. On the one hand, the fares, but also, as is mentioned there, the commercial revenue. You have in the metro here, you have retail business, you have advertising. You have also land value capture. You know that whenever you build a metro line, the value of the property around the line is going up. And that's something that is happening now today in London. When they built, I'm sure you know that when they built this famous Crossrail, which will be known as the Elizabeth line, and which will be commissioned in the next few months, there was a project of 24 billion, no, sorry, that's Grand Paris. It's something like 18 billion pounds. And who paid for this? The state, but also the industry, or the business community, who asked for that line. And when they asked for that line and they promote that line, the government said, okay, but then you have to participate. And they contribute up to £5 billion through a tax, a special tax. This is another way to fund public transport. But as you see, any penny is needed. And the question is then, and I'm taking back to what our chairwoman said, is how about social fares? how about unemployment? How about poor people? And there are options that we will come back in a minute. One next, please. So fare-free public transport is a political issue. It's a political tool. I would even say it comes together with some populist approach that is emerging more and more today, unfortunately. The key arguments, we saw them from our colleague from Tallinn. Environment concern was number 3, revitalization of urban areas, equity, and encourage modal shift. In the case of Hasselt, for instance, which was the first case, it's a small Flemish city which had an old center and where cars were not welcome. After a few years, and it stopped now, what we discovered was that the modal shift was nil. The only thing that happened is that walkers and bikers, when it's raining, are taking the bus, the free bus. But the car people, they never moved to the bus. So there is no evidence in any case of free public transport that there is a modal shift from car. And I remember that from a political viewpoint, that's the major objective. You know, putting the old people, the present people for free in a bus is not, maybe for social reason you can consider it, but in terms of mobility, it's really nonsense because it's basically not helping. Because car people don't care about the price. And I was, you know, the person representing Mr. Tarabella is totally wrong. If you go to Liège, you go one way and return, 30 euro. If you go the same with your car on your own, how much costs a kilometer of a car? It's something like 30 cents. 30 cents times 200 means 60 euro. So it's because people don't know how to calculate the cost of their car. They just calculate the price of diesel or of the gasoline, but they don't take into account the depreciation of their capital, their insurance, the maintenance, and all this. And the cost, the 0.3 euro that I'm giving for a kilometer, is the national price that you get indemnified by the Belgian state when you're driving kilometers for the account of the state. So it's not true that the car is cheaper. It's just the front price that looks cheaper. In fact, public transport is very cheap in Belgium in comparison to other places, and the railways are complaining because when they make a benchmark with the rest of Europe, they're much lower than anywhere. So far so good. I think that if you debate this in the European Parliament, please take the time to collect facts and evidence of what is said. Next. So study shows, and when I say studies, it's all studies show ridership is much more responsive to service improvement than fare reduction. And I'm ready to deliver to our colleagues of Tallinn, who, by the way, are member of UITP, those studies. So basically, ridership may increase, but does little to reduce private car use and encroaches on walking and cycling share. And by the same token, it's reducing the investment potential because that money will not be usable for buying new buses or new trains or new tramways. Next. Then I want to make sure that we do not make a confusion between free public transport and social fare. Social fare is a pretty good institution. We all know that we want to help unemployed people. And for instance, during their period of unemployment, you can give them a very low price accessibility to public transport. That is part of the package that the unemployed office can deliver, and they do receive this. And I think that's the right way to help people to find, to be mobile and find new opportunity for work. It's true that there is sometimes free public transport as a tool for yield management. You know the yield management that is used in the airline or in the hotel industry. That means that if you want to reduce the volume at some point in time, you make favorable condition. And of course, you could say, okay, before 7 o'clock, it's free. You could also say it's 50%. And that would push people to come from 6 to 7 in the public transport. So it can help, but it's part of a yield management tool, and it's not just like a political tool. It's just a way to reduce problems of capacity at period where, waiting for the time where the capacity can be increased. In some place you can make fare free transport. In Roma, I think the attack service in the Centro Storico is free. And that's okay, but it's very limited, and it's, you know, it's few buses that are running around, not very much used, as far as I remember. It's especially the elder people that are using it because they don't want to walk in the Centro Storico. And then for specific events, you know, sometimes ago, about a week or two ago, the free car Sunday in Brussels, public transport was free. But that's a way to celebrate and to show that public transport. For me, when I was there, because I was there in 2002 when we organized the first free car day, the idea was let's give the opportunity to people that don't use public transport to use it one day and to see whether it works or not. Unfortunately, as you know, this fair, this feast in Brussels is basically becoming now a cycling event. And public transport is very much used, but it's a terrible use because you don't have enough capacity to take people. So finally, the customer experience is poor. But that's also political. So what next? What really, what we should, on the contrary, if you really want public transport to become the backbone of transit in a city, and especially in big and medium-sized cities, what you need to work on is on frequency, speed, and comfort. You need to develop, as a complement, car sharing, bike sharing. And of course, public transport has to embrace the digitalization movement, and the PT network should be extended. That is what public transport should be all about. And should continue. Your fare policy, as usual, makes it about 50% be covered by subsidy and 50% covered by the user. I want to stop, and we can come because I have some slide later, but I can use it later to stop now. I made a comparison when I was on television against this Mr. Steyaert who had introduced this, and I said, you know, I compare free public transport to a piece of land which is abandoned. When you have a piece of land which is not fenced, where nothing is happening and nobody's taking care of that piece of land, what happens after a while? First of all, you get waste. You know, people are dumping their waste on the free place. Then after a while, you get little traffic. You can see it in any place in the world. You get, you know, because it's a free place which is not respected. Unfortunately, that's how it is. Whereas when I decided to buy what I consider the beautiful tramway that we now have in Brussels, I bought 220 from Bombardier. And the discussion was all about how we're going to design those tramways. If you've seen the tramway, and especially the interior. And I finally decided, against the minister, but he was then later supportive, that we would bring glasses, steel, stainless steel, and seat in leather. And all people said, all the old engineers tell me, you're putting seats with leather, they're going to be destroyed after 5 weeks. They're still there. No destruction, nothing. Because people, when they get nice things, nice public transport, comfortable public transport, where they can really feel like they are in their public transport, they respect it. And that's much more important than the few pennies that they are paying whenever they have a year subscription. Thank you.
Grazie mille per il suo contributo.
Thank you very much for that contribution. I'm now going to pass the floor to Michiel van Holten, who is going to be speaking us today. He is used to be a member of the Dutch Parliament.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the initiative. It was mentioned already in 1972, I wrote my first book on fare-free public transport. And I left the subject some 20 years ago because I thought my thinking is sound, but nobody accepts it, so better forget about it. Until suddenly Tallinn introduced free public transport, I picked up somewhere in a paper 3 lines, and I sent a message to Alan, what's happening in the world? Something which is very sound thinking, and it's very nice that we sit together, because you will hear from me a totally different story than from my colleague here. He is an exquisite knowledge, he has an exquisite knowledge of public transport. No doubt about that. What he fails to see is that the world is more than transportation politics. That's the point. Now I wonder whether my screen is up. Yeah, that's from Zori. It was mentioned already in Poland. We had several meetings mentioned already by Elena Lakula in Tallinn, in Zori, and in Avesta. And last year, I understand, in Italy, in the north of Italy, Rovereto, wasn't it? And now we are here. And I was very pleased to see that finally there is an interest in the European Parliament for this subject. Next, please. Anyone dealing with the machine? This is probably, oh, this goes very quick, I must say, yeah. Interesting is that the argument used by my colleague, and I will not discuss too much about what he was saying because that comes later, I understand. I'll give my own presentation. Interesting is that my argument to go ahead with fare free public transport is exactly that already half of it is paid by the tax office. His argument is exactly the other way around. It's enough that we pay half of it, let passengers pay the other half. And then I start thinking, because that was the starting point of my thinking in the 70s, why do everywhere politicians agree to pay about half of the costs of public transport? And once they do so, why don't they pay for the other half? Now, then you start thinking. Please, next. First of all, it's not utopia. In the beginning, in the Netherlands, people told me when I started my political career in '69, I went to the Senate and then later on to the House of Representatives, and later I became Deputy Minister of Transport, promising in the coalition agreement that I would not say a word about free public transport, because the rest of the cabinet was very much afraid of those words. So, because of the sake of the coalition, I promised for 4 years to stall my interest in the subject. Everybody said, you are a utopian if you think about free public transport. But the fact is there in the world. How can you say that it is nonsense if in Tallinn 400,000 people are profiting from it? How can you say that? Tomorrow I fly to Shanghai for other reasons, but one of the reasons I'm there is to study with the companies on the spot why 3 million people in Shanghai have free public transport. 3 million! Gosh, that's something else than Brussels. And, you know, it's reality. And the examples of, please go on, of some other countries have already been shown. I hope you get my presentation later on. Therefore, I put in a slide with a number of websites where you can go for information. And among these is a website on which I placed the major document which we used in Avesta as documentation for the Conference on Free Public Transport. In that document, it is about 130 pages long, you find tens of cases all over the world, from the west coast of the US to Perth in Australia, in the former communist world, in the capitalist world. You find many examples of what is done in the field of fare free public transport. And here there is an essential difference. I always study and deal with fare-free public transport, because I'm not in favor of free lunches. I have been a reasonable politician always. I've always looked for the money paid by the taxpayers. What do you do with the money? That is important for a politician always to keep an eye on. Now, so I recognize there are costs. Costs have to be covered. There is no free lunch, and you pay it in one way or another. The second question is, who will pay? And the third question is, when do you pay and where do you pay? Next. Now, the example of Belgium has been discussed a little bit. I will give a spread of detailed data from the northern half of Belgium a bit later. From Poland, please, next slide. It's difficult, we can't do that ourselves. In Flandre, when it was introduced in 2002, calculations were made about the costs. If fare free public transport was introduced in Belgium, then the Belgian government, the Flandre government, the northern half as you call it, studied, of course, the issue, how much is that going to cost us to begin with all the seniors in our region, this half of Belgium, 6 million inhabitants. And then they calculated it, and the calculated cost was, if we make it free for all seniors above 65, this will cost us €15 per year per person. €15 per year. That's nothing. Calculate what it is per week. It's nothing. And the interesting thing is, I studied the same in the province of Zeeland, which is an adjoining province of Belgium in the Netherlands, southwest of the Netherlands. And I did a study in the province of Drenthe, which is in the northeast of the Netherlands. And in both studies, on behalf of the provincial governments, the result was it is about €15 per senior that it will cost us. In both provinces, it did not reach the executing state because of the majority of representatives thinking in terms of costs and not thinking in terms of results, of income, which is raised. The next one, please. I have here the figures from Flandre. Now, these are not fabricated by me. Let me first stress that. I'm a researcher. And I picked up the annual reports, which are official documents in Belgium, of the company De Lijn, which is responsible for the northern half of Belgium for public transport. And to save time, I only reproduce here the figures for 2002 and 2010. I hope you can read them, because there I can't read it, but here I hope it is bigger and you can read them. Now, the interesting thing is, in 2002, free public transport for seniors was introduced in Flandre. And there's all of a sudden a trend which was going down in number of passengers in that whole area up till the year 2001 was turned and started changing, moving upwards. Now, of course, you can say that this is not done because of the making free of transport for the seniors, but the coincidence of happening those two things at the same time is for me a little bit of a proof. You know, if at the same moment you cancel the costs for the passenger and the number of passengers goes up, then I have the idea that maybe there is a connection. By the way, there is another connection which is very interesting for Brussels. At the moment Brussels introduced free public transport for seniors, from that moment the number of cars owned by people resident in the city of Brussels per capita is going down. That slide I have not brought now, but since 2002 the line in the statistics of car ownership is lowering. Now, if anything is important for Brussels, I think then it is this. Because what is behind that figure? Behind that figure is that a number of those families where people were over 65 got rid of their second car. They still kept their first car because car is very useful, it's very easy, it's very convenient, but they could get rid of their second car because they could travel for free on public transport and they could make at home for every trip the decision, over 65, people like me, you know, shall we go together, shall we go together in the car or shall we go together in the subway? And because of the subway freedom, there is a tendency to move into the subway. Now, let's look at the figures. Passengers went up from 318 to 551. They went up, and look at the percentages, with 73%. The personnel went up only by 28%. It means personal costs per passenger are lower. Now, every business would love that. Then the passengers per staff member, consequently, go up, which is very nice. Every driver of a bus likes it when the bus is full. And if the bus is half empty, he doesn't like it. Number of passengers per staff member and per vehicle goes up, but with figures lower than the number of passengers, which means the vehicles get more people inside than outside. The kilometrage went up. The more lines, more buses, more frequencies, a lot of quality input, 38% up went the number of kilometers. The net income for the company, and that was the most interesting figure, which is never advertised in Brussels, and I'm sure if I would study the same figure for Brussels, I will get the same results. Net income for the company, you know, a lot of people got free travel. And nevertheless, the net income for the company went up by 30%. What the hell is going on? You know, how do you do that? And I think that's a very interesting subject.
Those are wrong, my dear.
That's,
you don't know.
The figures come from your annual reports. Net income for the company went up by 30%.
That's wrong.
So I went, of course, to the company and talked with staff members about this because I wanted to get the background of that figure. Because I said, how is it possible if the net income per passenger goes down with 24%, which is the next line, how can the net income for the company go up? Now, that's only partly explained by the growing number of passengers. It is also explained by the fact that there is an interesting phenomenon. If in a family, mostly men and women, and I'm saying something which is not fashionable at the moment, you can't say, most families, the man is older than the wife. Spouse, older and younger. Most societies in Europe, you see the same picture. The man, the husband, gets over 65. He got his free public transport card. He is mostly also the driver of the car. His wife still has to pay. What is interesting, the choice to go by public transport turns. Because one of the two can drive now for free in public transport. So instead of with 2 people in the car, you go with 2 people in the subway and the tram and the bus, and only one of those 2 has to pay. So the amount of money to pay plays a role. It was a lot. There was a small study done by the university here, by a student in a master's degree study. What is causing this phenomenon? And part of the explanation was these mixed families in age, where the older one in the family was for free and the other one has to pay. And the other one otherwise would be sitting in the car and not paying to the public transport. Now, the kilometers per staff went up also. In any case, all figures are very positive figures for any company to continue with such an experiment. And what is now the amazing thing in Flanders, of course, and in Brussels, now in Brussels still it exists, is that obviously figures are not the real issue. The real issue is who is sitting in the councils, who is sitting in the parliaments, who are deciding. When was the decision taken with Steve Stevaerts to go for this when he had the majority in parliament in Flanders? But at the moment that the majority turned in another direction, not because of public transport, but because of other reasons, there came another interest in the parliament. And therefore, I think it's very good that the European Parliament starts to work on it. I think there is a lot of research needed, which should be set up. And maybe in the latest discussion we have today, I could present some ideas for the research phase if you want to continue on this line of thinking. Next, please. This picture you will see better next for my colleague from Poland. This is an older edition. The spread of issues, and also Ellen, I think, showed it already. Next slide, please. This is PERS. It is included. Please go to the websites which I show there. I tried to get it out of their website into my website, and I failed dismally because my computer knowledge is not good enough. Go to the next slide, please, because this one here should have been a map of PERS, where a rather big area of the central city is totally free in public transport. The whole area, for everybody, also for foreigners, visitors, tourists, God knows who else. And they say they profit from it, and we continue with it for years already. And yeah, basically PERS is far away, not too many people go there, so we have not much knowledge about this here. Now, what are the motivations? There is next. The motivations to go for fare free public transport are of a great variety of reasons. And I list here in the second half of this list reasons of safety. Just an example from the city of Ghent in Belgium. Some years ago I met the alderman, which was a woman, in Ghent for transport. She had introduced free buses in Ghent from Thursday till Sunday night after 11 o'clock, from 11 till 3 at night. And that costs a certain amount of money. Not very big, but nevertheless it costs money. And I asked her, how do you finance this? And she said, that's exactly my problem. Because it appears on my budget in the council. I pay for it. But the result is that since we have introduced this, not a single young man or woman under 25 has been involved in a traffic incident during the night between 11 and 3. Because most of them, who in earlier times either took a bicycle or a motorcycle or a car, after some drinks, of course, they are now traveling by bus on the night lines which we exploit in Ghent. And this result, even if it is only one youngster who would not die during those 4 nights all over the year, if that happens, that saves already more money than all the costs I pay from the traffic budget. But my problem is that the result of that person not dying, first of all, is very difficult. Something which is not happening, you cannot prove. And secondly, if it delivers a profit, that profit goes somewhere else, and it is not shown in the budget. It does not appear in the budget of health, it doesn't appear in the budget of safety, it doesn't appear in the budget of security, it doesn't appear at transport. And so I have a problem in paying it and constantly convincing the council members to continue with this financing because I think it's excellent. Free University Amsterdam has calculated in a PhD study some 10 years ago that one person under 25 dying in a traffic incident costs €5 million. That's quite a lot of money. So if you can save one of those lives, you can pay a lot in the public transport sector. And that is why you have to look not only to transportation, but to other issues. Now, city planning, parking shortages. In my view, congestion on the road is the minor problem for the future. The major problem for the future is parking. Parking of cars. On average, a car in the Netherlands travels per day 45 minutes. And therefore, we cannot fight congestion. Because whatever congestion measure you take, immediately, out of all those cars who are not traveling, a number come for free because there is some space on the road. They will spend more than 45 minutes. They will move up to 50 and 60 minutes back again, and congestion will be at the same level. We spent in the last 5 years around Amsterdam €4.2 billion on road construction. The work is still ongoing. You can go and see it between Schiphol, Amsterdam, and Lelystad, where I live, that area, Almere, Lelystad. In that area, we spent over €4 billion on road constructing. And the state service, for which I worked 40 years ago, in charge of road building, itself, in its reporting on this project, wrote, after we have spent the 4 billion, nothing will have changed in the congestion problem in that area. And then I think, what is the rational thinking behind this? If you spend 4 billion, of course, what you could say, if they had not spent, the congestion would have been worse. Yeah, that's true. But if you spend 4 billion and you don't solve the problem, you should at least ask yourself the question, what am I doing? Now, why do I title my paper as Back to the Commons? I do it because so much of what we experience, this is the next slide, yeah? By the way, free. So much of what we do together, we pay together by taxes. People don't realize that often. Free public education, free sidewalks, bicycle paths, children's playgrounds in urbanized areas, the placing of street name signs, house numbering, street lights, traffic lights, parks, the police force, the fire brigade, the army. We pay for all those services, we pay collectively. And all of a sudden, someone is saying, and to make now the buses belong to this area of common paid services, that is nonsense. That's very strange. Are all these other purposes, why are they taken in? Is it maybe a mistake we made 60, 70 years ago, that we did not put up, at the same time that we put up road signs, that we also said, let's regulate the traffic and make that public transport is also available to everybody fare free. And of course paid on another way. I don't know how it is in your countries, but for instance in the Netherlands, people think that radio and television is free. Because we don't pay for radio and television. It's free. Partly it is commercial and partly it is public. But of course the public radio and television is paid. We have 3 television stations which are paid from the tax. But people don't know that they pay from the income tax is paid the television. They think it's for free. Of course it's not free. Now, so if so, then the question is, why is, please next, why not make all this public transport also free, available for all? Not next. Because the automobility is an important subject and raised by all the other speakers up till now, by the way. Interesting is that I assume that all of you have a car. All of you use a car. I have a car at home. And my wife and I, we just passed the 100,000 kilometer mark on a car which we bought in 1979. So you can imagine that we drive about 5,000 per year. We use it only for the area where I live, Lelystad, the new polder. It's very badly developed in that sense. And everything outside the polder we do by train and or plane or whatever. But if you look in the statistics of car ownership, then you see that 20% of the households has no car. 20%. That's the bottom part of society. 60% of the households have 1 car. And another 20% have 2 or more cars. Now in the province of Friesland, I mentioned it already before, I made a calculation for the provincial government on their behalf and on their request. And we found out that if from all families with 2 or more cars, we put an extra charge on car number 2, 3 and 4, and more, but we did not find anyone more, then we had enough income to finance the whole public transport system from the province of Friesland. And everyone owning 1 car was not charged. So then there was a totally different balance between using public transport or using your own car. Important is that the 60% of households where is 1 car, the normal pattern is that in the morning at about 8, 9 o'clock, the car leaves the house with the main income maker, man or women. And the rest of the family is at home without car. This means that and comes back the car in the evening by 5, 6 o'clock. Which means between 8 and 5, 50% of our households, that's a Dutch figure, but I guess all over developed Europe it will be about the same, 50% of all households between 8 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon have no car standing in front of the house ready for use. Car is gone. Is adding to our parking problem. These 50%, for them, the public transport system is the only system. And therefore, paying a fare is so important because if, as a mother with a few children, or as a woman who has another job to do, or as a man who is taking care of the house but is doing also the errands for the household, then they have no other way than either walk, bicycle, or take the bus. And this 50%, I think, is the 50% which should interest the politicians, which should interest the members of European Parliament and our members of our own parliaments. Seniors, housewives, the jobless, young men and women. And there are all interesting things happening. Leeuwarden, the capital city of Friesland, is becoming cultural capital of Europe next year in one of competition or contest, I think it is. And they take now in charge all the public transport of the whole province in that 1 year that Leeuwarden, the capital city, is the capital of culture for Europe. Very interesting phenomenon because Leeuwarden pays now for the whole province for people to be free, having fare-free travel from their homes to the capital city. We see on the other hand, in all of your societies, I guess, that we are liquidating all kinds of details. We are liquidating municipal offices. We are joining schools together. We are joining hospitals together. We concentrate functions. And at the same time, we don't deliver people the free chance to go. where they want. Go on, please, and I'll show only one picture left, which is the go on. Because then I will not, it won't back. Because the mayor of Bogota in 2013 held a major speech on free public transport and back, please. No, go up. The rich pay, the poor ride. That is more or less what is my purpose, of course, if you understand me well. Because if you pay from the tax, then, of course, it is the higher brackets of the income tax who pay most of the public transport costs, and they are basically not going into the bus. And the lower bracket of income taxpayers are the ones who use the bus, but they don't pay, because they don't pay enough taxes for it. So basically, the result of this reversal is that the rich pay and that the poor will use the bus. And the mayor of Bogota, that's the next slide, I think. Go on. Yeah. In his speech, I found the most interesting phrase, this one which I project here. A developed country is not a place where the poor have cars. That is what we think in a lot of politics, in particular the liberal parties, the right-wing liberal parties, at least for instance, in Holland, are thinking that everybody should have a car. The socialists, by the way, saw the same 40 years ago. Everybody had to have a car. The prime minister of my cabinet in the 70s, where I was a minister, he was also of that opinion. Everybody had to have a car, whether you are poor or not. A developed country is not a place where the poor have cars. It's where the rich use public transport. And there, of course, I return to some elements of quality which have been mentioned by my colleague on my left-hand side. I don't disagree on that point with him, but I only say, let us look at the essence of the politics which is behind it. It's not the beauty of the car, it is what you pay when you enter. That is the basic blockade of entering. Even if it is only 10 cents, it works. If it is 0, it works. Thank you very much.
Grazie mille per questo prezioso intervento.
Thank you very much for that very interesting intervention. And I should now like to give the floor. I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, I don't think. Wojciech Kiblowski. Okay, you are a researcher. And you are looking into the issue of free public transport.
That's a pretty good attempt at pronouncing my very difficult name, so thank you very much for that. Thank you for all the speakers thus far. Thank you for the invitation. I will try to speak from, yes, an academic perspective, maybe trying to a little bit reconciliate the two strong and well-evidenced but somewhat extreme views on what free public transport is. So a very negative view and a very positive view. No, not yet. I'll also use the word next. There is a lot of slides, I'm afraid, but let's hope we survive this. So what I'll be presenting here comes from two research projects. One, which is quite soon published, actually next week. If any of you happens to be in Toronto, Canada, there is a book being published, and part of this research will be published there. And two, my PhD dissertation, which I'll be defending at ULB in VUB, so actually two universities here. Although I had to fly here from Poland because I'm finishing my research there. So stay tuned for more. This is just a little bit, a little fragment of it. So as you may have already, heard, or that might be already your impression, abolishing fares in public transport is a controversial idea. So on the one hand, there is those, as we already have heard from Mr. Flosch, who say that from the transport perspective, especially from sustainable transport perspective, free public transport does not make any sense. And that comes from one of the gurus of sustainable transport mobility, Vincent Kaufmann, based in Switzerland. On the other hand, however, there are those who are, well, a little bit more famous perhaps, Naomi Klein, an environmental activist, who say that this is exactly what cities should be doing to tackle a number of social and environmental issues. So we have, again, two rather extreme views on what it is, or whether it should exist, that I think can be maybe not reconciled, but a little bit better understood. And before I address this controversy, I would like to first things first. So let's make sure that we know actually what we're talking about, how we define it, what it actually is and what it isn't, free public or fair free public transport. So yes, it's a fare-free public transport. And why I agree with Mr. Van Huntelen on this, we need to focus on both fare-free and public. Why? Well, first of all, there is this critique that was already made today that free public transport and free transit are terms that inaccurately suggest as if riding on board of transport was free and therefore nobody paid for it. So accordingly, fare-free basically clarifies the situation, and we know that it's free because it's fully subsidized. So it's a subsidy coming from some authority. Now public, because what kind of authority is it? Well, it's a public authority. There is a plethora of collective but private situations in which you don't have to pay. And you can think of hotel shuttles, you can think of company shuttles like Google's in San Francisco area or ABB in Tallinn area that are provided to workers or, for example, shoppers that can go for free to a supermarket from the housing area to some shopping center. So this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about a fully subsidized service that is public, and that's basically a subsidy coming from some kind of local government or regional government or, well, in certain but very few situations, a national government. Right? So with this out of the way, I think it's very important to also notice that not all instances of fare-free public transport are equal, and that depends on when and for how long fares are suspended, where the fare-free regime occurs, who obtains access to free rides. And in other words, that means that some cases of fare-free public transport can be identified as full and some are partial. Full is perhaps the most comprehensive and radical form. I define it as a system, public transport system, in which fares are abolished on a vast majority of routes and services provided with that network for most of the users, most of the time, and for at least 12 months. Otherwise, it's partial, and there is a variety of cases of partial fare-free public transport, starting with the temporary ones. So that can basically mean that a public transport authority wants to abolish fares originally for a long period of time, and then after this test, after some results that were not satisfactory, the fares are restored. That was, for example, the case in Stavanger in Norway, or Topeka, Kansas in US, Asheville in North Carolina. In some cases, fares are abolished initially already with this temporary period in mind. So, for example, that was already mentioned here a little bit, Paris, Krakow, Warsaw, Skopje, a number of other cities across Europe recently have been temporarily suspending fares to respond to air pollution levels, to basically deal with some sort of catastrophe, to be honest. So the situation in which the quality of air is so bad that more cars on the streets would basically lead to grave risk to inhabitants' health. There is unfortunately a recurrent theme of post-terrorist attack fare-free systems. So that happened in Brussels last year, in Paris 2 years ago. So immediately after the terrorist attack, fares are suspended so that people can safely return home. And in the first days after, they are often also free. That also is the case after natural disasters, as in Prague, in the aftermath of flooding in 2002. And funnily enough, somewhat induced by the institution we are here, a financial and political crisis, as in Athens in 2015, when the failed negotiation with Troika led to a temporary week-long suspension of fares in the capital of Greece. And then already mentioned Car-Free Day, which is some sort of an exception that happens in a number of cities, at least a couple of hundred cities around the world, not only in Europe. 22nd of December is where a lot of Europeans can take public transport for free. Then, there are a number of cases which are temporarily limited, so this limited period of time occurs regularly. Chengdu was mentioned, that's before 7 o'clock in the morning on the bus network, also in Singapore before 7:45 in the morning. In Jelenia Góra, that is the case on the very first day of the month, on weekends in Gorlice in Poland. Then, even bigger group of cities is where fare-free system exists but is somewhat spatially limited. So it either means that there is a specific section of public transport network. Perth was mentioned, that's also the case in Melbourne, for example. Singular service within a larger network. So I don't know if many of you knew that you can take a free bus from the airport of Boston to the city and then actually change to the metro system for free. But you cannot do it the other way around, funnily enough. There is a situation sometimes where a specific mode is free of charge. I don't know if any of you have taken a ferry in Amsterdam, but that is free of charge. While the metro and buses, you need a ticket to take that. And then there are also these situations in which you have one or two services, one or two bus lines usually, which are both fare-free, but then there's a question whether this is actually a network. I mean, we only have two lines, so can we actually call it a network? So I introduced some kind of distinction, so let's talk of a network from 3 routes, 3 services onwards. And that leaves a number of small villages, more rather than towns, a little bit out of this. Finally, we have really a vast amount, especially in Europe, in the Western European context, cities with socially limited fare abolition. So basically the specific groups that have the right to use public transport for free. And that includes children, youth, students, the elderly, low-income groups, the disabled. But then, funnily enough, in the Geneva canton, that also embraces tourists and visitors. So once you land in Geneva, you get a free ticket to use, I don't remember for how many days, I think 3. But you can move around the Geneva city, Geneva region for free. And in Krakow and Warsaw, a somewhat controversial policy of giving it regularly, or also temporarily, but regularly to car owners. So car owners not only have a car, but actually on top of that, they get a free public transport ticket to seemingly convince them to use public transport. The efficiency of that measure is a little bit discussable. So my work, and I think our interest, should be focused a little bit more on full fare-free public transport cases. The partial ones are interesting, and I might talk about them a little bit later, maybe in the discussion, but what I'm interested the most is the cities where this is, or towns where this is fully free. Now, the first of them appeared apparently, as far as we know, in Colomiers, in the town of Commerce in Los Angeles. The first European one appeared in Colomiers near Toulouse. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore since last year because of some political reshuffling, let's say. And it is until the 1990s that the US, or maybe even 2000, the US was where the most cases of fare-free public transport, full FFPT, that's maybe easier, existed. Since then, the balance shifted a little bit towards Europe. So today, next slide. Today, we have 96 cities and towns with full fare-free abolition. 56 of them are in Europe, 26 in US, 11 in Brazil, South America, 1 in Australia, and 2 in Asia, both in China. And this is where they are. I'm not sure you can see that in detail. Basically, well, without going into too much detail, the size of the dot is the size of the city, its population. The color of the dot corresponds to the year of its implementation. The darker it is, the later it happened. So we can see clearly that there is a small concentration in Brazil. There is a number of cases in US. They are mostly university campuses, natural parks and ski resorts, and small rural urban communities. 2 cases in China, I mentioned, 1 in Australia, but then most cases, as I said, were in Europe. Next slide. And here, that was already somewhat talked about already, there is 21 cases in Poland, full fare-free public transport cases. There is a number of others that are partial. Same in France, 20 cases. And then, well, Tallinn being the biggest dot, biggest case of fare-free public transport as of now. And then a smattering of others in Sweden, 1 in Faroe Island, 1 in Denmark. Yes, so basically that gives you the idea of some kind of spatial distribution of fare-free public transport. Now, how to understand that? Well, we can, as I mentioned at the beginning, we can easily jump to quite strong rhetoric and strong argumentation about why it should exist, why it shouldn't exist. My role here perhaps is to a little bit, shed some light on how we can understand what's going on here. Not only between the 2 gentlemen that spoke before me, but I guess between people who will be speaking after us too. So to understand that, I refer to 3 main perspectives on transport as such, and on fare-free public transport in particular, so as a specific policy instrument. So the first perspective is called neoclassical, the second sustainable, and the third critical. So according to the neoclassical vision of transport, let's say, transport is a neoclassical discipline. What does it mean? Well, it means that it's a rational discipline. On a systemic level, it refers to modeling, to econometric forecasting, to somehow, well, relying a little bit more on empirical data than theory, to somehow try to encapsulate and dissect key dogmas, key trends that can be modeled and, well, put to some kind of prediction of the future behavior of the actual transport users, passengers of public transport in this case. On the individual level, there is an assumption that passengers are rational beings. That basically, every day when we wake up in the morning, we make a rational decision, what kind of transport mode will I take today? Which I guess you will agree with me, not all of us really consciously do every day in the morning, and a lot of our transport behavior is not particularly rational. specifically because we do not have access to all the information that is out there. We don't really know what is the actual, that was already referred to, the actual cost of using our car against using public transport. A lot of this cost is subsidized. We actually don't know that it's subsidized. So that assumption is a little bit shaky there. But very importantly, according to this perspective, the key purpose of transport is to stimulate economic growth. So distance is considered to be detrimental to economic growth. Transport helps to shorten the distance, to shorten the time that we cover the distance in, so bringing economic actors closer to one another, and principally, of course, the employees and the employers. Well, according to this perspective, well, free public transport does not really make sense. Why? Because it's financially unsustainable, that was already mentioned today. Why? Well, it means decrease of revenue, right? We lose the revenue from fares. That leads to financial unsustainability. How can we operate and then even more invest in the network if we don't have money from the tickets? There are some other interesting arguments, though. It's accused of being irrational or inducing irrational behavior. Why? Because people start making non-productive trips, they engage in useless mobility, and there is this assumption then that, well, the ticket is what separates us from going mad, from going absolutely crazy. That by paying before we get on the bus, metro, or tram, we actually make a rational decision where we're going to go and for how long and why. Whereas without a ticket, we just go berserk, we take the buses in an unlimited way, which, well, I mean, we can already refer to Tallinn, is probably not the case. I mean, people are not crazy there because of fare abolition. There is also, and I was heavily referred to, this accusation that fare-free public transport creates an illusion that goods and services have no cost, that this creates some kind of devaluation of public service, vandalism, etc. Well, while this has happened in a number of cases in the US, in Europe there's absolutely no evidence of that. So basically there is no case of fare-free public transport in which we can see some correlation or causality between abolition of fares and vandalism. And also the question of homeless people or poor people who might not be looking the way that middle class do or smell not the same way as the upper class do, well, that's perhaps the problem of poverty, not a problem of fare-free public transport or transport as such. So there's a clear social issue because basically, the transport reflects, or the people who are in the transport, well, that reflects the social composition of the city. It does not really say much about transport itself. However, from this perspective, there are also arguments in favor. So there are those who say that, well, yes, we lose the money from the fares, but we also create some kind of revenue by cutting the operational costs. So there is no ticket barriers, there's no ticketing, there's no accounting, there is reduced personal costs, or this personnel could be employed in different ways. So there is some kind of saving made in that particular way. Then there is also a question, and I was also a little bit discussed, what share of public transport operational budget is actually paid for by the fares. And in some cities this might be a little bit high, so perhaps this discussion is a little bit difficult. In some cities, like in Tallinn, that was only at 1/3. So already we're talking about, well, basically contributing not with a half, but actually 1/3. So that issue is important to keep in mind. Then we move on to the sustainable perspectives on transport. And here, well, of course, transport is still considered to be a major contributor or facilitator of economic growth, and still there's some kind of rationality involved. We don't abandon that. But the key problem is the car. The key problem is automobility. That was already referred to a lot. Why? Because to create a good city that is healthy, that is socially cohesive, that is environmentally friendly, that is spatially also dense, that is, we don't live in the suburbs, right? So transport is a key contributor to that. How? Well, first of all, by, yes, increasing the quality of public transport, improving its service to attract car drivers, to attract car owners, so to have this model shift from the cars to public transport, to combine transport with land use policy, so we try to create our cities, our new settlements or existing settlements around transport, so that we really try to, well, push people, maybe it's not the right word, but we try to facilitate people taking public transport more. And there's a number of aspects there that we don't have to discuss today. But basically, from this perspective, yes, Vincent Kaufmann and Mr. Floch are right, saying that the shift from the car to public transport as a result of fare-free public transport is minimal. It's not the main aim of free public transport. Clearly, yes, there is some evidence of Tallinn that I'll be referring to as well, but that also, Representative Alan from Tallinn showed that this was not the key aim of the policy, to somewhat, improve or take us closer to sustainable mobility paradigm. And it is clear, there are studies showing this, that disincentivizing car usage through congestion charging, through parking policy, through, well, increasing the price of vehicles as such, might be a little bit more efficient, well, or basically is it more efficient, than reducing the cost of fare. However, there is a significant increase, there's a significant increase of public transport usage. And I find it a little bit ironic that very often public transport operator representatives are not happy because there is not a modal shift from the car to public transport, but they do not really notice, or they do not want to notice, that as a result of fare abolition, you have more passengers on public transport. How can you not like that? What is wrong with that? And I heard that from transport operator representatives in Tallinn, that we have too many people on board of buses. Well, you also have a municipality that wants to buy more buses and put more lines and improve the service. So what is actually the problem?
They don't buy new buses.
Well, they do. Well, I beg to differ. No. I mean, we can have a discussion, but they do. They actually keep doing that. Yes, in Tallinn. So there is also, well, an insignificant or a small increase of modal share of public transport is an increase nonetheless. So then again is this argument, it's not really doing, contributing to a significant increase. Well, it is contributing to one. So, we also have to try to keep that in mind. Now, well, moving to something, let's say, completely different. I mean, it's a whole lot of other ways of looking at transport that primarily look at transport not just as a transport policy. So actually put it in a very social, political, and economic perspective. So they see that transport is not just an engineering or mathematical discipline, but as a discipline, it's basically one element of urban or social life that is very important. But, there is a city around a bus stop. And the passengers that come on board of public transport are not just passengers, they're also citizens that, well, live in a particular social, economic, and political context. And transport does not really influence that, it follows that more than anything else. Unless, of course, we try to turn that relation around. For those who don't understand the French, in the post that actually comes from Brussels, it comes from a protest against a particular railway project that says 20 seconds gained, 20 housing units lost. So that, that it's basically against this craze of increasing speed, improving the rationality of the network at a very direct social and economic cost of very localized community, let's say. So there is a number of issues that are highlighted by these perspectives, but I think I said the most important thing. So it basically looks at transport as not only a transport thing, and also looks at mobility as a norm that, yes, it's widely accepted that we are mobile and we have to be more mobile, but also as any norm, as any social scientist will tell you, any norm is discriminative. So there are people who are more mobile than others, and there are people who already have access to a number of public transport modes and other transport modes, notably car owners, and there are people who are excluded from all that, and they're bound to use public transport. And Brussels is a very good case of that. There's a very high share of people who do not have a car, don't have a bicycle, they have to use public transport. And then combined with the fact that they might not actually have their papers in order, well, for whatever reasons, but they're still the inhabitants of the city, they do not qualify for any social discount because they simply do not exist. So they have to pay the fare. What happens if they caught without a fare? Well, increasingly the controllers, at least in Brussels, are accompanied by police. Who is there? Why? Well, also to fish out the people without the papers and then put them to relevant authorities and do whatever they see fit to do with them. Well, there's a question of how do we react to that in terms of transport. Now, so what is the perspective of this perspective on free public transport? Thank you. Well, it conceptualizes free public transport as some kind of harbinger of socio-political transformation. So it's not only about facilitating a modal shift or making or maintaining some rationality behind the system and maintaining economic growth as facilitated by transport, but it's about fundamentally changing the way the politics of transport in the city. Whether we agree with that statement or not, it's out there. It introduces a radically simplified use of public transport. I think we can agree on that. It, some say, shows solidarity with the weak, so those precisely who do not have access to other transport modes. They rely on public transport. They have to take it whether they like it or not. It somewhat goes beyond the discussion, which I find only productive only to a limited extent, whether we choose quality and we choose price. As we will see in the case of Tallinn, the quality has increased, and therefore, also the price has gone to pretty much zero. So seemingly this choice is probably often there, but not always, at least, not in all localities, not in all cities. Then, of course, yes, unconditional access, that means tackling social exclusion, tackling poverty, returning to the commons perhaps giving some sort of right. Then, of course, there's a number of critical questions. Do we want to give right to mobility unconditionally to all people? Isn't that supporting those who already have access to that, the middle class, the upper middle class, the car owners? Fundamental question, why do we want to give another great mode of transport to car owners who already have a mode? So perhaps we should actually deal with that before we increase their access to public transport. Or start with those who don't have a choice, who basically, as I mentioned, are bound to use public transport whether they like it or not. And then a question, well, a little bit more provocative, is actually free public transport something that passengers want? Do they actually demand it? Because studies show that that's not necessarily the case. And I would agree with Mr. Flosch that, well, quality is what passengers demand first before price. That is pretty clear. I don't know about Tallinn, perhaps that's a little slightly different there. To address these questions, of course, I don't have time and I'm close to finish. I went to 4 cities to study that particular policy instruments, and these cities were Tallinn, Žore in southern Poland, Aubagne, which it's not really a municipality, it's a set of 12 municipalities that is next to Marseille, and already mentioned Chengdu, which has only a partial system, so free public transport exists there on bus network before 7 a.m. on specific type of short distance buses called community buses. And it already existed on a large part of the bus network during some major construction work. So it's a partial system, but in a city that its core has 8 million, and its agglomeration has 14 million inhabitants. So it begs for some kind of study, because, well, it's probably the biggest case, it's the biggest case of partial free public transport in the world, ever. So, what comes out of it? Well, these are these cities. I don't know if you can guess which one is which. So, on the surface, they look very similar. I mean, you don't really have, except for Žore, which is in the bottom left corner, and Aubagne on the top right, there's nothing to tell you that it's free. I mean, in Aubagne, yes, buses have this little bus gratuit thing on the top. In Žore, we have a passenger that used to hide at the bottom of the bus. Now he doesn't have to because there is no fares. So it's a bit of a funny joke, I don't know. But in Chengdu and in Tallinn, we don't really see that, so there's no visibility of it. But under the surface, well, there is a number of things going on, obviously. And what turns out is that these cases are extremely different, despite free public transport being such a simple and uniform, seemingly, idea. So, starting with Tallinn, I'll be very brief. I understand that timing is limited. So, Tallinn is allegedly, at least, at odds with the sustainable vision of transport. That means that all sustainable transport experts from the city say that it's nonsensical, that it's bad, that it doesn't make sense, that it should not have been introduced. However, there is a 9% modal shift to public transport, as evidenced in the recent study. There was an earlier study that was quite plainly methodologically poor, that was reproduced by World Press. There was a figure of 1.2%. That figure is, well, it's factually right. But the facts, well, behind the facts, we also have to look at the methodology of how facts were obtained and how decent and how thick the methodological sample, the data sample was. And so in the second study, it's still not thick enough, but that's the best figure we have. And that's a figure that comes from the main critics of free public transport, so not the municipality. So we don't have to, look at Alan, who will give us a higher figure. We already have a little bit lower. That is, I don't know if it's high enough, but it's there. There was a shift. There's been a shift from cars to public transport. The shift from, yes, pedestrians and cyclists also occurred, but it's not that significant. But of course, yes, that critique is somewhat valid. Now, we could stop there, and I tell you, we will know nothing about Tallinn and free public transport. So looking at the figures and looking at the tables, the budgetary aspect of it tells us really not enough. The critical perspective on free public transport, however, asks questions that give, I think, quite controversial answers, notably about the fact that this has been introduced as a core periphery competition strategy. Why? Because it's available only to residents, and that means, as Alan was showing us, an influx of residents. Are they actually new citizens? Well, we don't really know. Around 60% of them actually never moved to Tallinn. Why? Because changing your residency in Estonia takes 15 minutes and requires a web browser and a friend with an address. So there is no way of actually policing this and making sure that someone actually moved to the city. It suffices to go online, change your address to your aunts or your friends, and you have access to free public transport. Good for Tallinn, not so good for those who are around Tallinn or elsewhere in Estonia. So basically, there's some new revenue for Tallinn and lost revenue for pretty much everyone else. That revenue is not lost in a spectacular way, so no municipality's budget collapsed. It was a small loss that was quite evenly distributed across the country, especially around the suburbs of Tallinn, but it's a loss nonetheless. Then, well, I'm sure that Alan will agree with me, it's an electoral strategy, it's a way of getting votes, which, okay, you can criticize as, well, these politicians, I mean, they are making politics. Well, what do you expect them to do? An alternative to that would be, and that's often the case not only in Tallinn, to take a decision in a closed room, behind a closed door, and justify it with mathematical modeling that no one understands unless they have a degree in transport engineering. So in this case, there was a referendum. It was a very controversial referendum, I'm not going to go into that, but the decision was publicly made, you could say, which is a little bit, you know, unusual when taking decisions about transport. And then finally, across the social strata, I mean, the people with income below 300 euro a month, below 400 euro a month, I mean, think about these figures. It's really not a lot of money. Unemployed, elderly, and youth use public transport more than before. So you have some kind of policy of social inclusion that's clear. The only group that does not use it, and has a minimal decrease, is those with an income above 1,000 euro, which in Estonia is, well, it's a upper middle class. So there's also a question there, why these people use it a little bit less? Because from a perspective of sustainable transport, you would say that's probably people who actually have a car and they have a choice. So as a result of that choice, and as a result of fare-free public transport, they use this public transport slightly less. Now, moving on to Orban. The story is a little bit less complicated over there. There is a 235% increase of passengers as a result of implementation of free public transport. There's actually a further almost doubling of that as a result of implementation of a tram line. But I mean, a tram line that appeared as a result is not necessarily related to free public transport. It happened somehow by the way or meanwhile, which again returns to this question, quality, price. Well, price is zero, quality is increasing. Why? Because in a particular French context, there is a municipal tax that can be charged or levied against companies that have more than 11 employees, and that tax can be increased while once you have reached a threshold of 100,000 inhabitants, which happened in Aubagne right before implementation of FFPT, and then once you actually implement a tramway, a mode and a right-of-way passage, en mode propre, as they call it in French. So that allowed the municipality to raise revenue. Interestingly enough, the local businesses that paid that tax were all in favor of that. Why? Because they basically thought, and they probably right about that, the employees do not use the car, they go to their work for free, using public transport that is basically more relaxed, less stressful. So over there, what is a key improvement is that the social and spatial accessibility is highly improved, which is strikingly different from a neighboring Marseille, where you probably have heard about the banlieue, where the youth are clearly spatially and socially excluded from the center. They need to pay €2 fare to go to the city center. The drivers turn into policemen that have to verify that everyone has a fare. I was in Marseille for a week. Daily, I saw at least 20 young people jumping over the gates. So there's also a question of the efficiency of all this policing and securitization and barriers that in Marseille quite simply create some kind of a paradox. But it's exclusive nonetheless. So in Aubagne, there was a clear measure of tackling that head on. Jaurès, it's a much simpler story. So that's the next slide, thank you. There is very little social, well, in the discourse of the policymakers, of the local stakeholders, they might refer to a number of social aspects, but in fact it seems that it's a pretty economic neoclassical instrument. Basically, a contract with an intermunicipal operator that was paid, so with fares, was altered, and several new lines replaced that, and these new lines are operated by a private operator at a lower cost to the municipality, and that lower cost allows to abolish fares. It's pretty simple. So that somewhat contradicts the arguments that, it's an uneconomic measure. Well, here it is implemented exactly as an economic measure, as a cost-cutting, policy. And then again, we have a dramatic increase of passengers, primarily because it was an underused network. There was really not many people on board of buses. Unfortunately, well, again, the data is not exactly the data before, especially after we have some, but before it's not really solid enough when it comes to municipalities, so we should also take it with a grain of suspicion. And then finally, Chengdu. So Chengdu, again, these small, I mentioned them already, community buses, short distance buses that are always for free. They are operating on routes from 2 to 3 kilometers. So short distance, 2 to 3 kilometers, that's short distance in Chengdu at least. They basically operate either within small neighborhoods, so they have frequent stops and they spit out passengers at a regular bus stop when they can change to a regular paid bus or paid metro, of course, or they operate at the end of long cross-urban lines. So basically, by implementing these small buses rather than regular big buses, these community lines are quite small, I mean, it's small vehicles, that basically allows the municipal company to reduce costs regarding vehicles. So these big vehicles are put in the lines that are actually high capacity, and these are low capacity lines. And they have statistics showing that a high percentage of these passengers that take these free buses then change, I mean, that basically allows them to access other modes of transport that are actually paid. So the saving comes from that too. What is the critical aspect? Well, that's a question that transport researchers would probably never ask. I'm not sure that you've ever heard of that, but, well, Chinese people are dealing on a daily basis with some rural-urban apartheid, because the rural migrants to the city simply have absolutely no rights. They have no right to use the healthcare, education, and all kind of other aspects of urban welfare. And this is a huge exception. So basically, wherever you come from, it only takes you 1 minute to go to a kiosk, buy an electronic ticket, and it works. It's free. It means free on board of these buses. And no one asks you questions where you came from, whether you pay taxes in the city, whether you have any rights or not. So they are some kind of sans-papiers, people without any rights. Unfortunately, that's the situation in all major Chinese cities, and these rural migrants are coming in masses, having no rights. Well, in Chengdu, they have a right at least to free public transport. My last slide is basically about, well, 3 main conclusions. One is that it seems like a very simple idea. It is, perhaps, but it comes out in a variety of practices that are either neoclassical, sustainable, or critical, or combining all of that. That means that there is no single model of doing it. Alan mentioned it a little bit, that Tallinn is perhaps not a model because of this tax situation that allowed the city to raise additional revenue. Well, then Bratislava is a little bit trying to do that, apparently. So, but indeed, there is no one way of doing that, and there shouldn't be one way. So I don't know if there is, I have absolutely no idea about the European way of dealing with transport policy, but if you're thinking about doing some model for that, I think it's probably not the way to go, because its success, in inverted commas, relies highly on the local context. I don't think that it's a policy for all cities around the world. I would never say that. What I would say is that cities can probably, in all cities we can have a debate about that. Maybe in 90% of them, the result would be, no, let's not do that. We're fine with the system that we have. But I think if we ask a number of critical questions about the transport situation in our cities, then perhaps, well, this debate would actually be very interesting, because it would not be only about transport, but it would actually be about our city. Because transport, whether we like it or not, whether the transport expert like it or not, it's not only about transport. Thank you. Next slide. Sorry, that's the very last one. That's the book. So I think you will have to buy it. I mean, you are all rich politicians, so you can pay €20 for that. For all those who don't have money, contact me and I will send you a free e-version. But not if you're a politician. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. So now we have our final speaker this morning, Mr. Lukasz Ślugowski. He's an opinion leader on the topic.
Thank you for the invitation. I have a presentation with this. Yes. Free public transport in Poland. Introduction, effects, conclusion, and future. Next slide, please. For these groups, the right for free travel is granted by the national law. Blood donors are not included, but they are granted with the right for free travel by almost every city. Next slide, please. For these groups, 50% discount on fares is granted by the national law. There are also other discounts on trains for some groups. Next slide, please. In the cities I have analyzed, the fare income represented 20–40% of public transport budgets, sometimes more, rarely less than 10%. The ticketing system cost represented 5–12% of the incomes. For example, in Krakow, it was fair income was 220 million zloty, and the ticketing system cost was more than 24 million zloty. Next slide, please. Before 2013, there was only 2 cities with free public transport in Poland. In 2012, our free trade union August 80 started the campaign for free public transport. It successfully gained media attention, and the idea of the free public transport was adopted by some local politicians in local elections in 2014. Next map, on the next slide, shows the result of our campaign and the local elections. Red dots on the map and this red spot are the cities with the free public transport for all or for their inhabitants. Yellow dots are the cities where public transport is not free, but the right for free travel is granted to more groups than it required by the national law. For example, in Warsaw, the right for free travel is granted to students under 16, in Krakow under 12, in Kołobrzeg on the north, on the coast, under 22. In some cities it's free for drivers or for unemployment people. Blue dots are the cities where the free public transport is to be included. They will become red soon. Now we have 34 cities with free public transport, not 21 like Wojciech said. They will become, it happening really fast. This map was generated on the 5th September, and since then 2 other cities have already introduced the free public transport for all. Next slide. Here we have 6 biggest cities with free public transport for all or for their inhabitants. In 4 of them, an extra-urban system is functioning too. Next slide, please. The table shows a share of the public transport cost in the budgets, in the city budgets. N column in bold is the share in the year of the introduction of the free public transport. Next, N1 and N2 columns are shares on shares 1 year and 2 years after the introduction of free public transport. Penultimate column is the fall or increase of the share of public transport costs in the city budgets in relation to previous year. The last column is the fall or increase of the share in years after introduction. In most cities, after the introduction of the free public transport cost in the city budgets first increased, but later, next year, fell. Surprisingly, in some cities, it has fallen, although the public transport was being expanded. Also, in some cities, the share has fallen below its level corresponding to the year when public transport was paid. Next slide is the continuation of the table. Next slide, please. Okay. This table shows cities where public transport had not been functioning before the introduction of free public transport. Therefore, there is no comparison with previous years. Next slide, please. In cities where the free public transport was introduced, many effects have been observed. First and foremost is the reduction of car traffic and the increase in the number of passengers. However, other effects were also observed. It was the activization of the elderly, noted in Żory, Bełchatów, and Lubin. The elderly started to commute to the city gardens to have some rest and plant the plants, which was rarely observed before. In Żory, the increase in sales of businesses in center of the city was observed. It was observed that the elderly started to commute to the city center, by buses and came back to home with full bags of shopping. It was not like that before, when people had to pay for tickets. In Lubin, the increase of the efficiency of Kurds has been observed. The reason was the fact that the Kurds were not overwhelmed with the fare dodgers cases anymore. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Okay. Conclusion. The research conducted by Łukasz Komorowski let us draw other conclusions. It's a myth that the free public transport is being introduced only in the cities where public transport was cheap. These have been done both in the cities where the free public transport was cheap and where it was expensive in the terms of the average share of public transport in the city budgets. Finances mattered less than the politics and the social effects. The reported effects of the introduction of the free public transport let us draw another conclusion. To reduce car traffic, it's not enough to swap paid public transport into a fare-free public transport. Bus routes and bus stops localizations should be carefully planned. Reduction of the car traffic is faster in the cities where extra urban system is functioning. More travelers prefer free public bus than the car. Until now, the free public transport in Poland, as in other countries, has been introduced in small cities where the car traffic has not been such a big problem as in big cities. But the potential of the free public transport is clear and visible. I think that in the big cities and agglomerations, the free public transport, including train connections to nearby towns and cities, without restrictions, will have a huge positive impact in reducing car traffic. Apart from the reduction of car traffic, it will provide huge savings in city budgets because maintaining roads will cost less. It may even turn out that some of the big roads investments are unnecessary. Instead of continuing the fight for city space between pedestrians and cars, new green areas will be developed like it was in some examples of the free public transport in the world. The free public transport will give us healthier and less stressed inhabitants, more green areas and cleaner air in city. There will be savings in the healthcare, less car accidents, lower consumption of oil, faster moving around the city, and more mobile community. It is a sustainable future. Next slide, please. In 2008, there will be a new local elections in Poland. I hope that the free public transport will be a major issue in these elections like it was in 2014. I think that the free public transport is our future, not only in Poland, not only in the cities. The future of this solution is free, regional, national, and the pan-European system of public transport. If someone thinks it is impossible, they will not be the ones who will do it. Like people who in previous historical epochs didn't believe in free common education and healthcare. Next slide, please. I really like this quote. One president of the city told me it's completely impossible when I asked him about the possibility to introduce the free public transport. 3 months later, he introduced free public transport. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. I should like to thank Dr. Lugowski. And this brings us to an end of this morning's contributions. Most of them were in English this morning. It might have been quite difficult for some of you to follow, but this afternoon things are going to be different and more are going to be in Italian. So I don't know if anybody's got any questions. Could you turn your microphone on if you're going to speak, please? Yes. I've got a question to Mr. Van Hulten and Mr. Alakula. Now, there seems to be a conviction that public transport is sustainable for the future, and that this is a concept which could really be up and running. However, we have heard of certain instances where things are really in crisis. Now, we've heard that in the world there are 96 cities, 56 of which are in Europe. So statistically speaking, we're talking about more than 100 million citizens in the world, and they having access to free transport. Now, why are 96 cities in the world offering this new service of free transport? And why have they left the other 6 billion citizens behind in so doing? Is this just a political issue? Or is it a politico-economic issue? Or is it just an economic issue? Thank you.
Chi vuole rispondere per prima?
Who would like to respond first? We'll have a question and then an answer, and we'll take it like that, one at a time.
Go ahead.
Fair, free public transport is a political issue. I think that is very clear. All politics, of course, cost money. And interesting is that in all presentations, costs came up very loudly. And the great question is, of course, what is the income you are getting from the costs you are making? And therefore, I gave already the examples, and there is a whole long list of what we pay for collectively in order to survive in our cities. If I look at that, I sometimes think basic income is already here, another discussion issue, you know. Why are we doing so difficult about fair, free public transport? Economically, with the figures from Flanders, I cannot say, but my colleague disputed me, but regretfully enough, he left. The outcome for the company was positive, and therefore the company wanted to continue the lane. That's the yellow buses you see also all over Brussels, because they serve Brussels and they serve Flanders. They were positive, they wanted to continue. And for a while, the politicians in Brussels, as well the regional government as the national government, was in favor of the idea. I think for political reasons. And the political reasons had to do with what I explained as all those families where there is no car standing in front of the house between 8 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So if, as a politician, you are interested in the mass of people which are at the base of society, because that is more or less the people I'm talking about, if, as a politician, you are interested in that base and you want to get their votes, then this is a good issue. If you think I must consider it economically, purely on transportation issues, then I think you are far too narrow in your reasoning. You are not looking at all those other possibilities. I found it interesting that you left out one element from Chengdu, which I think is the most important one, and which was interesting. I had a correspondence with them about it, that it does not appear in their defense of fair, free public transport. So I wrote them, why is my argument, which I distilled from your practice, not used by you in your defense of your system? And what was that point? That point was that apart from all the other nice things which you mentioned, and to which I agree, no problem, there is one decision taken in Chengdu which was very remarkable. And it was that all buses, 10,000 buses, All buses are free between 5 and 7 in the morning. And what did happen? You know, people is everywhere the same. A lot of people who normally went to work between 7 and 9 started thinking, of course, hey, if I just move up an hour, I get before the 7 o'clock limit, then my travel costs is gone. Interesting for the company was that the buses running between 5 and 7 were already running, but mostly empty. Now they filled up. But what was the real interesting point I found? It was that if enough people moved the beginning of their working hours 2 hours earlier, what do normal people do? They also stop 2 hours earlier. So the late congestion between 5 and 7 in the evening disappeared because a number of people, a great number of people, who traveled early before 7 o'clock to work, started returning home from 3 to 5. And so the basic congestion between 5 and 7 suddenly evaporated. It was displaced to the empty hours between 3 and 5. And I think if you look at Brussels, the same would happen here. If you made all the public transport before 7 o'clock free, look what happens to the congestion in the late afternoon and in the evening. It changes totally the picture. And that I found an interesting consequence. And it had nothing to do with traditional transportation economics. If I have a chance later today maybe to explain something about what I think is needed as research in this field, it is don't give European research for free public transport to transportation professors. That is the worst gender to give it, because they think in a far too limited view. I'm a geographer by academic training. I was a professor at university for governance. I was dismissed because of age a year ago, so I had to leave. Nevertheless, what I think is the issue of fair, free public transport has ramifications in all different areas of society. And transportation professors mostly look at only the transportation consequences in costs and eventually in income which can be derived from it, but they forget about all the other elements. It's part of emancipation policy, in my view, because mostly it is women who are locked up in their homes as the car has left for work with the husband. So it is part of emancipation policy. It is part of social policy. It gives chances to poor people to have mobility. The figure which was found by the colleague Klembowski, that the little amount paid plays a role. An important role locally is that if at the lowest level of society you save on transportation fares, where is the saved money going? Because it is not lost. It doesn't disappear into the bank. If people do not have to pay any more for the bus and the tram and the subway, there are a few euros per day left over. And they are spent locally, because this kind of people, they are the local spenders on the small expenses. Here in Brussels in 2002, and maybe that was before your time as parliamentarians, in 2002, when it was opened, the free public transport for seniors, in the inner city, the Liberal Party was very strong. A lot of shopkeepers and similar people. They were liberals, they were against. But suddenly they found out that from the moment that free public transport was introduced for the elderly, indeed happened what was expected. Thousands of elderly people, in particular in weekends, came to the city center. They came to the city center for shopping and for restaurants. And they took a coffee and an apple pie. And you know, suddenly we discovered, there was some research done on it, but not enough, I think. What happened was that what people saved on the subway, that was €4 in a couple. 2 times €2, €1 up, €1 down. They had not to pay any longer. They saved €4. And they went to a restaurant and they bought coffee with apple pie for €10. You know, these are the consequences. And I think that is where you have to look. And therefore I say it is a political subject. It's not an economic subject because of the ramifications in the whole of society. And that is where politics count. Thank you.
If I may add, I heard from the question that why we have left behind non-residents and the residents of the other areas. It sounded also in translation of the question. For us, it has been fiscal. The reasoning for it has been fiscal, not political, for doing it this manner. Issue itself is, of course, entirely it's public money. All decisions related to public money are political decisions, no doubt about it. But for a city, it was fiscal. But from the very beginning, Tallinn campaigned for for expansion of free public transport area to the counties surrounding Tallinn and to the nationwide. And we have made also from the very beginning also intentionally international campaigning of the issue. So we have done our best to involve others too. In Tallinn context, it's important to notion when it emerged, the prospect of implementing free public transport. It has been heavy contradiction, heavy fight between the capital city, capital municipality, and national government, national level. So in Tallinn, the free public transport was made pretty much in opposition to the national government's will. And now, when the national government changed, only now it became possible that free public transport will be expanded to the county bus lanes as well.
Can I just add one thing? Yeah. I mean, to briefly address the question, why is there only 96 cities and not more? And, you know, why not more cities? I think one and primary reason is that there is this, what I talked about, new classical and sustainable dogma. That's what transport researchers do. That's the questions they ask. We saw it this morning. The questions are limited. The answers are correct. But since the questions are limited, free public transport is nonsensical. I mean, the man that left this morning, he is convinced, and he is right, in the context of the questions that he's asking, because he's not asking social questions, spatial questions. He's basically looking at the transport network as a model, and the model does not function if the fares are not there. Now, take just one question. How much does it cost to not just build, but to renovate a major road, let's say 3 kilometers? How does that compare to the total annual fare income in a city? Well, very often the maintenance of one single, important street, but just one street, costs the same as or even more than the annual income from the fares. So if you just immediately jump scales from the scale of the public transport network, and we look at the whole traffic situation, transport situation in the city, we don't even go to other disciplines of urban policy, we see that there is a huge disproportion there. It's a political priority. But transport engineers and transport experts, well, they regard politics as something that, since they don't have influence over it, something that is bad and something that they try to avoid as much as possible. Now, that's the first reason. The second reason might be that it doesn't work in these cities. I don't know if they, but the problem is that I don't know if they actually have ever had a debate about it, have they actually had a discussion about it, any reflection on it. So, as I said at the end of my presentation, I don't think it's a model at all, and I don't think it's something that should work or can work in any city, every city. We have to know that before we actually say that. I'm not sure that this is the case. And I don't know if anyone, no one said that here, I think, even the biggest proponent of it. That would be my quick answer to that.
Ok, grazie. Ecco, prego. Possiamo andare avanti?
Okay, thank you. Well, we can continue until 12:30 if necessary. So, good day, everybody, and thank you very much for this important discussion, and thank you for the help which the European Parliament has given us to discuss this. Now, I think that what I have to do is more related to the technology of transport. I belong to the Association of Engineers for Traffic Transport in Padua, and we have been around for 60 years. Now, coming on to Dr. Flausch here, I hope that he'll be able to respond. because perhaps he's the only voice in this room who was referring to a certain approach. He talked about this being political, and I should like to know what are the fundamental political issues at the moment. Obviously, safety, security, and economy. Now, what about the topic of health and safety of citizens? This has a direct cost on families, but an indirect cost on the municipality and its inhabitants as a whole. Now, we do know that accidents have a very high rate. It's one of the major causes of mortality in the world. So, what is going on in this respect? Certainly, this has a cost which has an impact on all citizens, whether or not transport is financed from public or private coffers. So, there are many people, above all young people, who are suffering from drugs and other problems. There are a lot of people who are out on the streets. And my question is to Mr. Flausch, when we're talking about public transport for all, shouldn't we looking also at the issue of sustainable mobility, looking at the environment as well? Also looking at both private and public means, looking at carpooling, car sharing. This is certainly something which is going to increase also. And it was quite right when somebody referred to the fact that you can't have one size fits all for each city. I come from Naples. 3 million people live in Naples. But in Naples, there are enormous amounts of movement by transport. And we have the public transport system, and the public transport system is failing. It's failing because there hasn't been proper regulation, there hasn't been proper control for years, there haven't been proper direct aids. Of course, this costs money. You've got to check tickets, you've got to check controls, and certainly I think it is important to look at how you can provide more incentives or fewer disincentives to public resources as well. We need certainly improvement in quality of our public transport system. And as Mr. Flausch says, this has to be sustainable. It also has to be economically sustainable. So if we don't have public transport free to all, perhaps we can have it at certain times of day, or perhaps we can have it for some sectors of the population. So this is a very important public issue, and I think that if we tackle this properly, we can provide a savings for everybody, both direct and indirect. There was a reference before, for example, to the legal aspects. And we also have to bear in mind accidents that occur and the insurance companies and how they're involved. And sometimes you get false claims. All this costs money. I think that not only should we be talking about public transport, but we should be thinking very carefully of how we invest public money in transport as a whole, public transport and also roads and other infrastructure. We have to make sure that we take a new approach to all this and really put public transport at the center of the way in which we focus on it. Well, thank you very much. Well, you were talking about a lot of different things here, but I think, yes, it's important too to talk about public transport fare-free. But perhaps we've got a little bit of room now for other questions. Now, I know the UITP very well. I've been working in the transport system, and certainly one of the objectives of the UITP is to double the PT2 between now and 25. Local transport, on local transport. So I'm not going to defend Dr. Flausch here. He knows very well how to defend himself. But that is the UITP's objective. Now, on public transport in Italy, whether we're talking about Naples or Rome, we have had problems in the past years, and it's true. There's a lot of people who are not paying their fare evasion, but I think a lot of this is because of a problem of cost. 50% of the costs are costs which are borne by the people themselves, and it's all highly inefficient. And we need to look at how this happens, why this happens, and what changes we should be making. It's a problem of cost above all. So I think this idea of doubling public transport, we all agree with this, but we need to look into the strategies, the price of the ticket, what the subsidies for the ticketing should be. So perhaps we can look at the solution. People have referred, for example, to how this all operates in the United Kingdom. Certainly this afternoon, we're going to be discussing this further. It's an honor for me to take part in this debate. But I think it's important that we pool our thoughts and see how we can actually move forward in the same direction together.
Prego.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. Bearing in mind that here mostly we're talking about passengers, number of journeys, and that being the benefit, I was wondering what the motivation should be for fare-free public transport in terms of reduction of pollution. We should also look at that side of things and sustainability. So I was wondering whether that's something that's been taken into account, and whether you've taken into account the real benefits that fare-free public transport might have environmentally. Have you done it? Have you looked at the real benefits?
As I sequenced, in Tallinn, the green package is on the third position only. And so it's not the first, not the second priority, but the third only. But yes, we do count traffic, and particularly the goal was not so much to achieve total decrease of traffic, but to get traffic down in the city center. And we achieved by 6%. The city center traffic is less. At the same time, we do observe there is an increase around the city center. So people are looking for parking sites around city center. But in Tallinn, and why it's on the third position only, again, it's flat land on the coast. The air issue is not it's not something what you can sell politically. People don't see, don't smell air situation. It's not like in big cities, not in like in southern medium-sized cities. It's flat and medium size, and then on the coast. But in regard of Mr. Flausch, very much noted here, I want to say it reminds me very much of the skeptics of the industry, the skeptics of the transport operators. It was exactly what we have experienced and what we have seen in Tallinn, and today I can speak about it already in the past. We have had also the skeptics among the transport operator, municipal transport operators, which lasted 3-4 years. They were not believing from the beginning and for long after implementing free public transport that they didn't believe it will last. They didn't believe it will be the service will be better. They did not believe it will be invested additionally and heavily more to public transport. They were afraid that they will lose funds, and only now its 5th year is ending. I would say the last year, maybe a little more, our transport operators started to take neutral, sometimes even positively neutral stances on the free public transport. They were skeptics too, exactly as a UITP, as a general, as the representation organization of the operators. So and I have seen it also not only in Tallinn, the same in Polish cities. What I had a chance to speak, and even Oban, it's everywhere. The operators don't believe it will last. But what Tallinn proves is that as a politically locked to the issue, political establishment is also locked to prioritize public transport, and as a result, public transport will gain as in general, and in total, the sector, the service will gain substantially because political prioritization. Yep.
Just to quickly respond to a number of questions that were there, maybe starting from the last one. I think tackling pollution and contributing to some kind of environmentally friendly city is perhaps really not the main aim of free public transport, as Alan noted. Because on the one hand, yes, the impact on car traffic and the shift from cars to public transport is there, but it's not really huge. I mean, you could imagine a number of other solutions that you could implement if that's the problem, the bad air quality in your city. A fundamental question to ask is whether it actually comes from car traffic. In Barcelona, for example, it comes mostly from the cruise ships that come to the port. That is most of the pollution in the city. So, I mean, are you actually attacking the right culprit there? In Poland, there is a huge issue with individual heating systems that very often allow the inhabitants, the dwellers, to put whatever fuel they see fit. And of course, the quality of that fuel might be very poor, and that translates to a very high level of pollution. And the cars are also there, but I mean, depending on how you formulate the problem, the solution might be the free public transport or not. At the same time, a number of cities have been introducing exactly fare abolition to tackle pollution, like Paris, Madrid, Warsaw, Krakow, temporarily, right? So they were using this particular instrument exactly to tackle pollution. Then on the other hand, well, reducing fares to zero encourages more mobility. So you can also ask that question, do we actually want people to move more, and why, and what kind of people? Now, if it's the people who were immobile before, or less mobile, then perhaps this is a social policy. But there is a valid question whether we are not actually, introducing some kind of paradigm in which mobility comes at no cost, not fair cost, but basically environmental cost. That we somehow raising this awareness, which I think is false, that going across the city to for whatever reason is actually a good thing. And then again, you can counter that question with another one. Do you really think people will cross distances to reach a little bit of a cheaper shop or engage in activities that they never engaged in just because there is no fare? And that leads me to the second point. I don't think that ultimately the quality of transport, whether it's bad like you mentioned in Naples or Rome, depends on fares. I don't think so. I mean, key reason why transport is good or bad is a political decision to support it or not. Fares, so the money that passengers pay, that's a side issue. I mean, they can help. They don't have to help, as we see in Tallinn. Have you ever been to Tallinn? Have you seen the quality of public transport there? It is increased with fares or without them. It was increasing with fares. It's increasing without the fares. So basically, whether you support public transport over cars, for example, I think that's a fundamental decision. And trying to somehow, use the excuse of the discussion with the fares or not, in the context where actually public transport is not supported in the first place, I find it a little bit strange. In Brussels, 10% of the income from fares is lost due to traffic. Buses and trams are stuck in traffic, and therefore you have to put more buses and trams. And the drivers, so to remain, to maintain the frequency of public transport, you actually have to spend more money, and you lose the money that you raised from the passengers. So actually, if you dealt with traffic in the first place, if you put trams and buses in out-of-way sites that they don't have to share with cars, and therefore the public transport is fluid and frequent, then the question of fares is really secondary. I mean, we really don't make much money with the fares in the first place. And I'm not sure, you mentioned the main problems or themes in transport as safety, security, and economy. I think that this is one way of looking at it, but another way of looking at it is equity and poverty. I mean, there is increased poverty in cities across Europe. So, I mean, basically, free public transport is not solving all the problems. It's solving problems as we define them in a particular way. And I think this is challenging some kind of dogma, some kind of approach. I'm not really in agreement with you that Mr. Flausch was the only one using some kind of, coherent way of thinking. I would very much like to argue with him about his description of the case of Hasselt, which I think was factually incorrect in many respects. Just to end with that, over there what happened was that what he called a populist mayor, well, call it however you want him, basically refused to build a new ring road and instead abolished fares. So it's a direct decision to not subsidize a car industry and car infrastructure and subsidize public transport. I mean, are we in favor of that? I think we are, no? I mean, this is probably the thing that we should be doing. And then the question of fares is really secondary then.
Ok, grazie.
Okay, thank you very much. Just one brief response, please, from you. We are going to run out of time and the interpreters have to leave us at 12:30.
I want to back to the issue about the air pollution, because in Poland I observed in Christmas, in every December, the smog has disappeared in every year when we have Christmas. Smog just disappeared because nobody take car and go to the city centers to work and other places. So that shows us how big problem is the car traffic. Thank you.
Allora,
Thank you very much. If there aren't any further questions, if you do have any, in fact, perhaps it's better to ask them at the end of the afternoon session. I think maybe it'd be best to close the morning session here, unless any of the speakers have got anything else they'd like to add. In that case, as regards lunch break, we will be here at 2:30. My assistants will be outside to help you get to one of the Parliament canteens. We'll be back here, perhaps, let's say 2:20, so that we can get started at 2:30 prompt.